There is a kind of silence that does not feel like peace. It is the silence of a woman sitting alone in a hotel lobby in Phoenix, Arizona, on a Tuesday morning in October, holding a cup of coffee she has not touched. Her name, as far as the world knows, is Nora Vasquez. She is 31 years old. She works as a community health outreach coordinator for a nonprofit that serves low-income families in the south side of the city. She is quiet, steady, the kind of woman her coworkers describe as someone who shows up. And on this particular Tuesday morning, a man across the lobby sees her, really sees her, and his entire world falls apart in the space of a single breath. That man is Raymond Cole. He is 62 years old, silver-haired, worth somewhere north of $4 billion, depending on which quarter you ask. He is the founder and chief executive of Cole Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm with its fingers in defense contracting, pharmaceutical logistics, and commercial real estate across 14 states. He has survived a Senate subcommittee investigation. He has survived 3 divorces. He has survived hostile takeovers, federal audits, and the kind of press coverage that would have ended lesser men years ago. Raymond Cole does not get rattled. Raymond Cole does not freeze. That is what his people will tell you, the ones who have worked beside him for decades, the ones who have watched him walk into rooms where the air was already thick with threat and come out the other side without so much as a wrinkle in his suit. But in that hotel lobby in Phoenix, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, Raymond Cole sees a woman wearing a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a tiny half-moon pendant, and his coffee cup falls from his hand and shatters on the marble floor. Raymond Cole had spent 40 years building an empire. He had survived hostile takeovers, Senate investigations, and 3 divorces. But the one thing he never saw coming was a $20 necklace on a stranger's neck. What happened next would unravel a secret buried for a decade, and cost him everything he had spent his life protecting. This is that story. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop your city or state in the comments right now. We read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button, @TalesByT+, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us get into it. To understand what that necklace meant, and why a man with $4 billion turned white as chalk the moment he saw it, you have to go back. Not to the lobby, not even to Raymond Cole. You have to go back to a lake house in Vermont, on a warm June morning 11 years ago, and to a little girl named Isabella Cole who loved to fish off the dock before anyone else in the house was awake. Isabella was 9 years old the last summer anyone who loved her saw her. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, wide-set, the kind that noticed everything, and her father's jaw, set and determined even in photographs where she was laughing. She was small for her age but made up for it in presence. Her third-grade teacher at the Whitmore Academy in Connecticut, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Hale, would later tell investigators that Isabella Cole was the kind of student you remembered for the rest of your career. Not because she was the loudest in the room, but because she was the most alert. She asked questions adults did not think to ask. She remembered things adults assumed children forgot, and she wore, every single day without exception, a delicate gold necklace with a tiny half-moon pendant that had belonged to her late mother. Diana Cole, born Diana Marchetti, in Stamford, Connecticut, died of a brain aneurysm when Isabella was 4 years old. She was 38. She had been a landscape architect, a runner, a woman who made friends in grocery store checkout lines and remembered their names a year later. By every account of the people who knew her, Diana was the emotional center of the Cole household, the one who made the sprawling Connecticut estate feel like a home rather than an asset. She left behind a husband who was already more business than man, a 4-year-old daughter who barely understood what gone meant, and a half-moon necklace that Isabella would not take off for the next 5 years. Raymond gave it to Isabella the week after the funeral. He told her it was her mother's favorite thing. He said her mother wore it on the day she was born. Isabella believed him because she was 4 years old, and he was her father, and fathers do not lie about things like that. Raymond Cole was not always the man he became. People who knew him in his 20s described someone different. Hungrier, yes, but also warmer. He grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, the son of a machinist and a school secretary. He put himself through Boston University, on a combination of scholarships and night shifts at a packaging plant. He had the kind of drive that people who come from nothing tend to develop. The understanding that the world is not arranged in your favor, and that every inch of ground you take by force. He was good at finance the way some people are good at reading rooms or fixing engines, instinctively, before he fully understood the mechanics. He started Cole Meridian in 1988, with 2 partners, and a line of credit his bank almost did not approve. By 1998, he had bought both partners out. By 2005, Cole Meridian was managing a portfolio worth over $800 million. By the time Isabella was born, The number had crossed 2 billion, and Raymond Cole had transformed from a driven young man from Worcester into something closer to an institution. The problem with becoming an institution is that you start to think like one. You start to measure everything, relationships, loyalty, risk, in the same language you use to measure quarterly returns. People who worked inside Cole Meridian during the years leading up to Isabella's disappearance describe a culture that was effective, profitable, and cold. Decisions got made fast. Sentiment was not a factor. Raymond was not cruel. His longtime assistant Margaret Webb would say years later in a deposition, but he was precise. He treated problems like problems. He did not distinguish between a failing investment and a failing relationship. Both were liabilities to be managed. His third marriage to Claire Beaumont happened in 2010, when Isabella was 7. Claire was 48 at the time, 14 years younger than Raymond, a former lobbyist with a reputation in Washington circles for being extraordinarily good at navigating the gap between legal and advantageous. She was striking in the way that people who have spent their careers performing competence tend to be composed at all times, expensively dressed, impossible to read unless she wanted to be read. Raymond's friends, the few he had who spoke honestly, said that Claire was the first woman he had met since Diana who did not seem intimidated by him. What they did not say, but what several of them thought, was that this was because Claire was not impressed by Raymond Cole, so much as she had identified him as a useful structure to build around. Isabella did not like Claire. This is documented. It is not rumor or reconstruction. It appears in school counselor notes, in a letter Isabella wrote to her former nanny that was recovered years later, and in the recollections of at least 4 household staff members who were interviewed during the investigation. Isabella was 7 when the marriage happened, and 9 when everything fell apart, and in those 2 years she said and did things that, with the benefit of hindsight, read less like a child being difficult about a stepmother and more like a child accurately assessing a situation that adults had chosen to ignore. She told her nanny, a woman named Rosa Jimenez who had cared for her since she was 5, that Claire went through her father's office when he was traveling. She told her school counselor that the new house rules felt like they were designed to keep her out of rooms. She told a classmate, in a note that was kept and later became part of the public record, that she did not think Claire actually liked her father. She thought Claire liked what her father had. Whether Isabella was right about Claire, the full truth of that would not emerge for years, is something we will come back to. But what matters for right now is this. By the spring of the year Isabella turned 9, something had shifted inside the Cole household. Staff who had been with the family for years began quietly leaving. Raymond's schedule, already grueling, became more erratic. He was flying to Washington more frequently, meetings that his calendar listed only as consultations, no names, no firms. And Isabella, who had always been the kind of child who moved through the world with a kind of confident alertness, started, according to Rosa Jimenez, to seem watchful in a different way. Not curious, careful. What Raymond Cole was doing in Washington during those months is now part of the federal record, though it took years and a federal grand jury to put it there clearly. Cole Meridian Holdings, through a subsidiary called Meridian Logistics Group, had been operating a defense supply chain contract with the United States Department of Defense since 2007. The contract, which covered the management and delivery of equipment and materials to overseas military installations, was worth in the neighborhood of $600 million over its initial term. It had been renewed twice. On paper, Meridian Logistics Group was performing exactly as contracted. In reality, according to the federal indictment that would eventually be filed, the company had been systematically overbilling the government for years, inflating unit costs, billing for services that were never rendered, and routing the difference through a layered structure of shell entities that made the money extraordinarily difficult to trace. The scheme, prosecutors would eventually argue, had diverted somewhere between $300 and $400 million in taxpayer funds over the course of 6 years. The Department of Justice had been quietly looking at Cole Meridian since early the previous year. Not aggressively, there were other priorities, larger fish, but a DOJ Financial Crimes Division analyst named Thomas Briggs had flagged an anomaly in Meridian Logistics billing records during a routine audit review. And that flag had not gone away. Raymond Cole knew the flag existed. He had sources inside the procurement network who kept him informed. And as the spring of that year turned towards summer, and the DOJ's interest began to look less like routine review and more like focused inquiry, Raymond Cole was, by the accounts of those close to him, operating under a level of pressure that even he was struggling to contain behind his usual composure. And then one weekend in June, he took his family to the lake house at Whitaker Lake in Vermont, and everything that had been held together by money and control and silence came undone. Not in the way Raymond feared it would, with federal agents at his door, but in a way he never could have anticipated. A 9-year-old girl found something she was not supposed to find, and Raymond Cole, A man who had spent 40 years treating every problem as a liability to be managed, looked at his daughter and made a calculation that no amount of money, or power, or subsequent legal maneuvering has ever been able to fully explain to the people who loved her. That is where we are going. But before we get to that weekend at Whitaker Lake, before we get to the morning the dock was empty and the necklace was gone, and a father made a phone call that set everything in motion, we need to understand the woman who would, 11 years later, be sitting in a Phoenix hotel lobby, wearing that necklace, without the faintest idea of who she really was. Nora Vasquez, as she knew herself, grew up in the foster care system in Massachusetts. She was placed at age 9, the timeline matters, and we will come back to it, with a family in Springfield, and she moved through 3 additional placements before the age of 14, when she landed with a foster mother named Gloria Reyes, who, by Nora's own account, was the first adult in the system who treated her like a person rather than a file. Gloria was a retired school cafeteria worker who had been fostering children for 20 years. She lived in a 2-bedroom house on Walnut Street and kept a garden and made arroz con leche on Sunday nights, and expected her foster children to do their homework at the kitchen table before dinner. She was not warm in the way that people who make a performance of warmth are warm. She was warm the way that consistent people are warm, through reliability, through the kind of steady attention that tells a child, without ever saying it in so many words, that they are worth paying attention to. Nora aged out of the foster system at 18 and enrolled in community college on a Pell Grant. She worked nights at a convenience store and later at a hospital cafeteria while taking classes in social work. By 24, she had her associate's degree and a job with a nonprofit health organization in Springfield. By 27, she had moved to Phoenix for a better position, more resources, a larger organization, a city that felt far enough from everything that had come before that she could breathe differently. She had no family that she was aware of. She had a small apartment near the Camelback Mountain area, a group of close friends from work, and a habit of buying small things at thrift stores and Goodwill. Books, mostly, and occasionally jewelry, because it was something she and Gloria used to do together on Saturday mornings, and it was the closest thing she had to a ritual that felt like home. 2 years before the day Raymond Cole saw her in that hotel lobby, Nora was walking through a Goodwill in Springfield on a visit back to see Gloria, who was by then in her 70s and slowing down but still kept the garden, and she stopped at the glass jewelry case near the front of the store and saw a delicate gold necklace with a tiny half-moon pendant. It was priced at $3.99. She thought it was beautiful. She bought it without thinking much about it. She put it on in the parking lot, and Gloria said it suited her, and they went and had lunch at the place on Main Street they always went to, and that was the end of it. Or so Nora believed. She did not know, could not have known, that the necklace had been sitting in that case for less than a week, donated in a box of miscellaneous household items from an estate sale lot that had been purchased by a picker, which itself had come from a storage auction in Burlington, Vermont, where a unit registered to a shell company called Meridian Asset Services LLC had gone unpaid for 14 months and been liquidated. She did not know that inside that storage unit, according to investigators who would eventually search it, were 43 sealed cardboard boxes containing the personal effects of a child: books, clothing, school art projects, a retainer in its original case, a photograph of a woman in a yellow dress standing in a garden, and a handwritten letter in crayon addressed to that woman, dated 3 weeks after Isabella Cole was reported missing. A letter that began, "Mama, Daddy says you are watching from somewhere. I hope you can see me. I am okay. I am trying to be brave." She did not know any of this. She knew only that the necklace was pretty, that it cost $4, and that she had worn it every day since because it felt, in a way she could not quite articulate, like something she had always owned. Raymond Cole first saw Nora Vasquez across the lobby of the Sheraton Grand Phoenix on the morning of October the 8th. He was in Phoenix for a 2-day investor summit that Cole Meridian had organized, the kind of event designed to project stability and momentum to the firm's limited partners at a moment when, behind closed doors, Raymond's legal team was managing a situation that had grown considerably more urgent over the preceding 6 months. The DOJ inquiry that had been simmering since the previous year had escalated. A grand jury had been convened in the District of Columbia. Raymond's lead attorney, Stephen Vance, had advised him in the strongest possible terms to project normalcy, to travel, to meet investors, to be seen doing the unglamorous work of running a legitimate business. So Raymond Cole was in Phoenix, standing near the lobby coffee station with a cup in his hand, when a woman walked in from the street wearing a coat and a half-moon necklace that he had last seen on a dock post at Whitaker Lake 11 years ago, and everything he had built his life to protect crashed down on him in the space of a single second. His security detail later reported that he had said nothing. He had simply stood there, coffee cup tilted slightly, until gravity finished what had begun. The cup hit the marble. His lead security officer, a man named Darren Walsh, moved toward him immediately and asked if he was all right. Raymond Cole looked at Darren Walsh and said, "Find out who that woman is. Get me her name." And then he straightened his jacket and walked to his first meeting of the day as if nothing had happened, because Raymond Cole had been performing composure for so long that by this point it was not even a performance. It was just the only face he had. By the end of that morning, Darren Walsh had a name. By the end of that afternoon, Raymond Cole's private investigator had a file. And by the following morning, Raymond Cole was on a plane back to Connecticut. Not Phoenix, not Washington. To make 2 phone calls he had hoped he would never have to make. The first was to Stephen Vance. The second was to a man whose number he had not dialed in over a decade. A number he had kept in a separate phone in the back of a drawer. A number that connected to a voice on the other end that said simply, "I was wondering when you would call." We are going to follow every thread of this story to its end. We are going to find out what happened at Whitaker Lake on that June morning 11 years ago. We are going to find out who made the decision, and how it was carried out, and who helped, and who knew and stayed silent. We are going to find out who Nora Vasquez really is. Not just her name, but the cost of what was taken from her and what it took to survive it. And we are going to find out what happens when a man who has spent his entire life believing that enough money can insulate a person from consequence finally runs out of runway. But first, we go back to the lake. We go back to June. We go back to the morning the dock was empty and a father called 911 and told a dispatcher his daughter had drowned. And then, before the search team had even reached the water, called his lawyer. Whitaker Lake sits in the northeastern corner of Vermont, about 40 minutes outside of Burlington, at the end of a private access road that Raymond Cole had paved himself in 2003, because the original gravel track made the drive from the highway feel too long. The lake is small by Vermont standards, about 300 acres of dark, cold water, surrounded on 3 sides by forest, and on the 4th by a gently sloped lawn that runs from the main house down to a private dock. Raymond had purchased the property in 1999 for a price that his accountant described at the time as aggressive, and that Raymond described as an investment. He was not wrong. By the time of Isabella's disappearance, the property had tripled in value, and the main house had been expanded twice. A guest wing added in 2004, a boathouse constructed in 2008, until the original farmhouse structure was barely visible at the center of a compound that sprawled across nearly 9 acres. Raymond came to Whitaker Lake 4 or 5 times a year. He did not fish. He did not swim. He did not do the things that most people who own lake houses do with them. What he did was walk. Early mornings, before anyone else was up, he would walk the perimeter of the property along a path he had worn into the grass over 20 years. And during those walks, by his own later admission, he did his clearest thinking. The lake house was where Raymond Cole solved problems. It was where he made the decisions that his professional advisors were too careful or too cautious to make for him. It was, in the language his first business partner once used to describe it, where Raymond went to be Raymond without witnesses. Isabella loved the lake house for different reasons. She loved the dock. She loved that early in the morning, before the adults were awake and the day had organized itself into schedules and obligations, she could walk down to the water with a fishing rod and sit by herself and think her own thoughts without anyone managing her. She had been fishing off that dock since she was 5 years old. Rosa Jimenez, her nanny, had taught her how to bait a hook. Isabella was not particularly interested in catching fish. She was interested in the quiet, in the way the water looked before the sun was fully up, in the particular quality of early morning silence that exists in places far enough from highways and cities that you can hear individual birds rather than a general mass of sound. She wore the half-moon necklace even when she fished. Rosa had asked her once why she never took it off, not even to sleep, and Isabella had said because it means Mama is right here, and pointed to the place just below her collarbone where the pendant rested. The weekend of June 14th began on a Friday afternoon. Raymond, Claire, and Isabella arrived at the lake house sometime around 4 o'clock. The drive from their Connecticut estate took about 3 hours, and by the accounts of household staff who helped with the packing, the atmosphere in the vehicle was not warm. Raymond was distracted. He was on his phone for most of the drive, according to the housekeeper who helped load the car. Claire sat in the front passenger seat and said very little. Isabella sat in the back with a book and her fishing rod, already packed and ready for the morning. The caretaker at Whitaker Lake was a man named Gerald Mast. Gerald was 69 years old at the time, a compact, quiet man who had maintained the property for Raymond since 2001. He lived in a small house about half a mile down the access road, close enough to respond quickly if something needed attention, far enough to stay out of the Cole family's way when they were in residence, which was the arrangement Raymond preferred. Gerald mowed the lawns, maintained the dock, kept the boathouse in order, and handled the small repairs that a property of that size constantly generates. He had known Isabella since she was 3 years old. He called her Belle, which she pretended to find irritating, and actually loved. He had taught her the names of the birds that nested in the tree line along the eastern edge of the property: the red-winged blackbirds, the cedar waxwings, the great blue heron that had been using the same spot on the North Shore for as long as Gerald could remember. Gerald told investigators that he saw the family arrive on Friday afternoon and that everything appeared normal. He did not speak with Raymond that evening. He did his usual evening check of the dock and the boathouse, confirmed everything was secured, and went home. He told investigators that he slept with his bedroom window open in the summer, and that at some point, he estimated around 10 o'clock on Saturday night, he woke to what he described as raised voices from the direction of the main house. He was not certain what he heard. He did not hear individual words. He heard the cadence of argument and, underneath it, at least once, what he described as a child's voice, high and sharp in a way that he recognized as distress, rather than ordinary upset. He lay in his bed for a few minutes listening. The voices stopped. He told himself it was a family matter. He went back to sleep. He has carried that decision for 11 years. What was said in the main house at Whitaker Lake on Saturday night, the precise words, the sequence of events, who said what and to whom, and in what order, has never been fully established in a public proceeding, because the only people present were Raymond, Claire, and Isabella, and by the time the courts were in a position to compel testimony, Raymond was facing criminal charges and exercising his constitutional right not to answer, and Claire was operating under the terms of an immunity agreement that limited the scope of what she was required to disclose. What is known from the evidence assembled by investigators over the years that followed is that by Saturday night the situation inside the Cole household had reached a point that Raymond could no longer manage through the usual means of money and patience and strategic silence. Isabella had found something she was not supposed to find. The specifics emerged gradually over the course of the federal investigation, pieced together from financial records, internal communications recovered from Cole Meridian servers, and the eventual partial testimony of people who had been close to the situation. What investigators believe happened is this. At some point during the spring of that year, Isabella had been in Raymond's home office in Connecticut, a room that was not formally off-limits to her, but that she understood instinctively to be her father's space, a place you did not linger in, and she had seen documents on his desk. She was 9 years old. She could not have understood what she was looking at. She could not have known that the spreadsheets and internal memoranda spread across her father's desk detailed a billing structure that federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most systematically concealed defense procurement fraud schemes they had encountered in 15 years of white-collar investigations. She could not have known that the numbers on those pages represented hundreds of millions of dollars in false invoices submitted to the United States government over 6 years. She did not know what any of it meant. But she remembered it, because Isabella Cole, as her teacher Mrs. Patricia Hale had told anyone who would listen, was the kind of child who remembered things. At some point in the weeks that followed, Isabella mentioned what she had seen to someone. Not to Raymond, not to Claire, to Rosa Jimenez, her nanny, in the casual, offhand way that children sometimes disclose significant information, not as a revelation, not as an accusation, but as a thing she had noticed and could not stop thinking about. She described papers with a lot of numbers and a name she had seen repeated across several pages, a company name that she sounded out carefully for Rosa, and that Rosa, who had no context for it, did not recognize as significant. Rosa, who was a careful woman and a loyal employee and who genuinely loved Isabella, did not immediately tell Raymond what Isabella had said. She thought about it for several days, and then, because she had worked in wealthy households long enough to understand that the wrong conversation with the wrong person could end her employment, she mentioned it to Claire. She told investigators later that she thought Claire would handle it quietly. She thought it would be treated as a child's innocent observation, gently redirected, filed away, and forgotten. She thought telling Claire was the safe choice. Safer, certainly, than telling Raymond directly. She was wrong about all of it, and the weight of that mistake has stayed with her every day since, in ways she described in her deposition with a directness that left the attorney questioning her momentarily without words. What Claire did with that information, how quickly she told Raymond, what she said, what he said in return, what they decided together or separately in the days between Rosa's disclosure and the weekend at Whitaker Lake, is not entirely reconstructed. What is known is that within 48 hours of Rosa speaking to Claire, Raymond began making phone calls to a small number of people outside the firm. Phone records obtained through the federal investigation show contact with 3 numbers that investigators initially had difficulty tracing. two were eventually identified as belonging to individuals associated with a private consulting operation that had, in other contexts, been linked to discrete problem resolution for high-net-worth clients. The third number, the one Raymond would dial again 11 years later when Nora Vasquez appeared in a Phoenix hotel lobby wearing a half-moon necklace, belonged to a man known in the relevant circles only as a facilitator, someone who made arrangements that other people needed to be able to say they had not made themselves. Raymond Cole drove to Vermont on a Friday afternoon with his wife and his daughter, and by Sunday morning, only two of them were going home. The 911 call Raymond Cole placed on Sunday, June 16th at 6:47 in the morning is part of the public record. It runs for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Raymond's voice on the recording is controlled. Not the control of a man who has gathered himself, but the flat, precise control of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say before he picked up the phone. He told the dispatcher that his daughter had gone to the dock before sunrise and that he had woken to find her missing. He told the dispatcher he found her shoes at the water's edge. He told the dispatcher she could not swim well. He told the dispatcher he needed someone at the lake immediately. The dispatcher asked him whether he had checked the surrounding area, whether he had called for her. Raymond said yes to both. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. Raymond said of course. He did not sound like a man who had just discovered his child might have drowned. The Vermont State Police first responders who arrived at the scene 22 minutes later would note this in their initial reports, in the careful language of official documentation that is designed to record observations without prejudging them. Raymond Cole was standing on the dock when they arrived. He was wearing a fleece vest over a collared shirt, and his hands were in his pockets, and he watched the patrol vehicles come down the access road with an expression one officer described, in a note that would become significant later, as composed. Not numb, not dissociated, composed. As if he had been waiting, and now the waiting was over, and the next phase of a plan could begin. The Vermont State Police dive team arrived within the hour. They began a systematic search of Whitaker Lake that would continue for 11 days. The lake's maximum depth in the central basin was 41 feet, cold enough to slow decomposition significantly, dark enough that visibility at depth was measured in inches rather than feet. They used sonar equipment. They used divers in the deepest sections. They searched the shallower areas near the dock in a grid pattern that they documented photographically. They found nothing. Not a child, not clothing, not any physical evidence that a person had entered the water at that location. What they found on the dock post was the necklace. The half-moon pendant on its gold chain, hung on the post as if placed there deliberately, as if arranged to be found. This detail will become one of the central points of contention in the investigation that follows. Necklaces do not unclamp and hang themselves on dock posts. They fall, or they are removed by the person wearing them, or they are removed by someone else. The clasp on the necklace, examined by investigators, showed no sign of breakage or stress. It had been unfastened in the normal way. And yet Raymond Cole told investigators that Isabella always wore the necklace, that she never took it off, that he did not know how it came to be on the dock post because he had not seen Isabella that morning before she went outside. The lead detective assigned to the case was Carol Ashby. She was 51 years old, 22 years with the Vermont State Police, and she had worked missing persons and homicide cases across the state for the better part of 2 decades. She was not an excitable woman. She was not the kind of detective who drew conclusions before the evidence gave her permission, but she told her partner on the second day of the investigation, in a conversation that he would repeat under oath years later, that something was wrong with this scene. Not wrong in the sense of a clue pointing to a specific answer, wrong in the sense of a room where someone has rearranged the furniture and is watching to see if you notice. Carol Ashby noticed. She noticed that the dock security camera, a small weatherproof unit mounted on the boathouse eave that covered the dock and the lower section of the lawn, had recorded nothing from Friday evening through Sunday morning because, according to the system log, it had experienced a power interruption at 9:52 p.m. on Saturday. She requested the hardware for examination. Her request was initially delayed because the system was registered to a property management company that Raymond's office had to authorize the release. By the time the camera unit was examined by a technician, the finding was unambiguous. The power interruption was not caused by a failure. The connection had been manually severed at the junction box on the boathouse exterior wall. Someone had reached into the box and pulled the wire. She noticed that the shoes found at the water's edge, small canvas sneakers, the kind Isabella wore in warm weather, were placed parallel to each other, facing the dock, as if removed, and set down deliberately by someone standing upright and in no hurry. Children who run to the water in the dark, who slip, who panic, do not leave their shoes parallel and facing forward. Adults who are arranging a scene for investigators to find sometimes do. She noticed that Raymond Cole, a man who had reported his 9-year-old daughter missing and possibly drowned, called his attorney, Stephen Vance, at 7:23 a.m. 36 minutes after his 911 call, while the first responders were still conducting their initial assessment of the scene, before any investigator had spoken to him, before any determination had been made about what had happened. She noticed that the call lasted 11 minutes. She put these things in her notes. She flagged them for her supervisor. She requested authorization to conduct a more formal interrogation of Raymond Cole. What she got instead, 48 hours after Isabella's disappearance, was a visit from a federal attorney who informed her, without explanation, that the investigation might touch on interests that were currently the subject of a separate federal inquiry, and that coordination with the relevant agencies was advised before any significant investigative steps were taken. Carol Ashby, who had been doing this long enough to understand what this kind of visit meant and did not mean, went back to her desk and wrote a note to herself that said, "They are going to slow this down." And then she kept every copy of every document she had collected, because she had been doing this long enough to know that things slowed down sometimes and then sped up again, and when they sped up again, it helped to have the paperwork. She would wait 11 years for that speed to return. Raymond Cole released a public statement 3 days after Isabella's disappearance. It was crafted by the same public relations firm that had handled several previous situations for Cole Meridian, and it struck exactly the right notes: grief, disbelief, gratitude for the search teams, a private family's plea for privacy in an unimaginable time. Raymond appeared at a brief press availability flanked by Claire and his publicist. He wore a dark jacket and no tie. His eyes were red, whether they were red from crying or from the particular physiological effect of a man under catastrophic stress maintaining control in front of cameras. No one who watched the footage could say with certainty. He said Isabella was his whole world. He said he would not rest until there were answers. He said the family was cooperating fully with authorities. He said he loved his daughter more than anything he had ever built. Claire stood beside him and said nothing. She held Raymond's arm and looked at the cameras with an expression that the reporters in the room would later describe in different ways, as grief, as shock, as dignity, as blankness. And the variation in those descriptions tells you something about how little of Claire Beaumont's interior life was ever visible to anyone outside the walls she built around it. The search for Isabella Cole ran formally for 11 days, and informally for another 3 months. Search and rescue volunteers combed the surrounding woods. State police divers returned to the lake 4 additional times. A tip line received over 600 calls, most of which were the ordinary noise of public attention. False sightings, theories, people who wanted to be helpful and had nothing useful to offer. 2 tips were treated as serious. One involved a report from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a child matching Isabella's description walking alone on a rural road about 12 miles from the lake property on Sunday afternoon, the day of the disappearance. Police followed this lead for 6 weeks. It was eventually traced to a misidentification. The child seen on the road was a 10-year-old from a nearby town who had wandered away from her yard for about 40 minutes before being found by her parents, an incident that had not been reported to police, and that only surfaced when investigators began canvassing the area, door by door. The second serious tip came from an anonymous caller who told the tip line that Isabella had not drowned and that Raymond Cole knew exactly where she was. The call lasted 40 seconds. The number traced to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station in Burlington. The phone was never found. The caller never called again. Carol Ashby pulled that recording and listened to it 7 times. She could not determine the gender of the caller with certainty. The voice was low, clipped, careful. But she noted one thing in her files about that call, a detail she would return to years later. The caller did not say Raymond Cole did something to Isabella. The caller said Raymond Cole knew exactly where she was. Present tense, not where she had been, where she was. 11 months after Isabella's disappearance, with no body recovered and no evidence sufficient to support a criminal charge under Vermont law, the case was officially reclassified as inactive. It was not closed. Missing persons cases without a confirmed death are rarely formally closed, but the active investigative resources were redirected. Carol Ashby was reassigned to other cases. The tip line was discontinued. The story moved from the front section of the Burlington Free Press to an occasional update buried near the back. Raymond Cole donated $2 million to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children 4 months after the case went inactive. A conference room at their Virginia headquarters bears the Cole family name. The plaque was installed at a small ceremony that Raymond did not attend personally. He sent Claire in his place. She shook hands with the executive director and had her photograph taken and flew back to Connecticut the same afternoon. And the world, which had watched and wondered and speculated for a season, moved on, the way the world always moves on, because it has to, because there is always something else happening, because the capacity for sustained public attention is finite, and grief, even grief for a missing child, has an expiration date in the news cycle, if not in the hearts of the people who lived it. But Carol Ashby did not move on. Not entirely. She kept her files. The originals, not copies, because she had taken them home the day she was reassigned, and she told herself she would return them when the time was right, and she never did. She kept the photograph of the dock with the necklace hanging on the post. She kept the camera system report. She kept the phone records showing Raymond's call to his attorney at 7:23 in the morning. She kept the transcript of the anonymous tip call and her own handwritten note beside it. Present tense. She kept all of it in a cardboard box on the top shelf of her home office closet, and every few months she would take it down and go through it again, not looking for something new, because she had looked for new things many times and found nothing, but keeping the facts warm, keeping them alive, keeping them ready for a day she believed, without any evidence to support the belief, would eventually come. It came 11 years later, on an October morning in Phoenix, Arizona, when a woman walked into a hotel lobby wearing a half-moon necklace, and a man's coffee cup hit the floor, and the world that Raymond Cole had so carefully arranged around his secret cracked open at exactly the seam he had spent a decade making sure no one would find. We are going to find out what happened next. We are going to find out who made the call to Phoenix, who found Nora Vasquez's name, and what Raymond Cole did when he realized that the necklace he thought he had buried 11 years ago was walking around a city in Arizona, attached to a woman he had never planned for and could not simply make disappear. We are going to find out what Carol Ashby did when her phone rang for the first time in 11 years with a name she had not allowed herself to forget. And we are going to find out the truth about Nora Vasquez. Not the truth she had built for herself out of foster care and community college and Saturday morning Goodwill runs with a woman named Gloria, but the truth underneath that, the one that had been there the whole time, the one that a $4 necklace had been waiting 11 years to tell. There is something that happens to children who grow up inside the foster care system that the people who study it describe in clinical language: attachment disruption, identity fragmentation, chronic uncertainty, but that the children who lived it tend to describe in much simpler terms. They say they learned very early that the floor could move, that the thing you built your sense of safety on could be taken away without warning and without explanation, and without anyone asking whether you were ready. They say they learned to travel light, not in the physical sense, though sometimes that too, but in the emotional sense, not to put too much weight on any one person or any one place, because the weight of that investment, when the floor moved again, was the thing that broke you. They learned to read rooms the way other children learn to read books, quickly, accurately, as a survival skill rather than an academic exercise. They learned that the adults in charge were not always wrong, but were also not always right, and that the difference between the two was something you had to figure out yourself, often in real time, often without the luxury of making a mistake. Nora Vasquez learned all of these things. She learned them in the first foster home in Springfield, where she arrived at age 9 in the back seat of a Department of Children and Family Services vehicle, carrying a backpack that contained 3 changes of clothes, a library book that was not hers and that she had not had time to return, and a gold necklace with a half-moon pendant that she was wearing around her neck and that she did not take off when the caseworker asked if she needed help getting settled, and that she did not take off when the foster family's dog sniffed at her suspiciously in the entryway, and that she did not take off that night when she lay in a bed in a room that smelled like someone else, and stared at the ceiling, and tried to remember what her bedroom ceiling at home had looked like, and found that she could not. She had been told very little about why she was where she was. This is not unusual in the foster care system. Children are often given minimal information about the circumstances of their placement, sometimes to protect them, sometimes because the adults involved do not agree on what the truth is, sometimes simply because no one has thought carefully about what a child needs in order to make sense of something that does not make sense. Nora had been told that there had been a family situation, and that she would be staying with the Hendersons for a little while, and that a caseworker would check in with her regularly. She had been told not to worry. She was 9 years old, and she had been told not to worry, and she was in a stranger's house with a dog she did not know, and a ceiling she could not remember, and the one thing she knew with absolute certainty, the one thing she held on to in the dark of that first night, with the kind of grip that children develop when everything else has become uncertain, was the small, cool weight of the half-moon pendant against her chest. She did not know what she did not know. She did not know that the name on her paperwork, Nora Vasquez, was not the name she had been born with. She did not know that the records attached to that name had been constructed with enough legal scaffolding to survive routine inspection, but not forensic scrutiny. She did not know that the documentation of her history, the fabricated birth certificate, the false records of a prior address in Western Massachusetts, the manufactured paper trail of a child who had simply always existed as Nora Vasquez, had been assembled in less than 72 hours by people whose professional skill was the creation of identities for situations exactly like this one. She did not know any of this because she was 9 years old, and she had been told not to worry, and she was trying very hard, in the way that children do, to believe the adults. What Nora did know, without being able to articulate it, was that something had been done to her. Not something that had happened to her, an accident, a misfortune, the kind of bad luck that the world distributes without intent, but something that had been done. There is a difference, and children who have been on the receiving end of deliberate acts tend to register it even when they lack the vocabulary for it. She did not know who had done it or why. She did not know what had been taken from her or what name to put on the taking. She knew only the shape of the absence, the particular texture of a life that felt like it had been started in the middle, with pages missing from the beginning that no one would let her read. The Hendersons were not unkind. They were a middle-aged couple in Springfield, Gary, who worked for the city water department, and Patricia, who managed a dental office. And they had been licensed foster parents for 6 years and had cared for 11 children during that time. They were organized and consistent, which is more than many children in the system get, and they made sure Nora had enough to eat and clean clothes and a backpack that did not have holes in it for school. They were not warm in the way that stays with you. They were decent, which is not nothing, but which is also not the thing a 9-year-old who has lost everything needs most. Nora stayed with the Hendersons for 14 months before her caseworker determined that a different placement would better serve her needs, a phrase that was never explained to Nora in terms she found useful, and she was moved to a second home, and then a third, and then, at 14, to Gloria Reyes. Gloria Reyes was 63 years old when Nora arrived at her house on Walnut Street. She had been fostering children since her own 3 children were grown, partly because the house felt too quiet without them, and partly because, as she explained it to anyone who asked, she had been given more than she needed, and she did not believe in holding on to more than you needed. She was a small woman, Puerto Rican, originally from Ponce, who had come to Springfield in her 20s, with her husband Eduardo, who had died of a heart attack in 2001, and whose photograph sat on the living room mantel, in a frame that Gloria dusted every single week with the focused attention of someone performing an act of devotion. She kept a garden in the backyard, tomatoes, peppers, herbs, a fig tree that had no business surviving Massachusetts winters, but that Gloria refused to give up on, and that somehow, improbably, produced figs every August. She made arroz con leche on Sunday nights. She expected homework done at the kitchen table before dinner. She called everyone Mija regardless of gender and had opinions about everything and shared them freely and was almost always right. Nora had been moved enough times by the age of 14 that she arrived at Gloria's house with the practiced composure of a child who has learned not to invest too quickly. She was polite, she was quiet, she did her homework without being told. She stayed in her room more than she needed to. Gloria, who had seen this particular kind of careful distance in children many times before, did not push. She made the arroz con leche. She kept the lights on in the kitchen in the evenings. She let Nora come to her on Nora's schedule, which took about 3 months. And when Nora finally came, not with a dramatic revelation, not with tears, but with a question about whether Gloria needed help with the garden, because Nora had noticed the tomatoes needed staking, Gloria said yes, and handed her a pair of gardening gloves, and did not make a production of it, because she understood that sometimes, the way a child tells you they are ready to trust you is by asking to help with the tomatoes. They were together for 4 years. Nora graduated from high school with a B average and a near-perfect attendance record. Gloria attended the ceremony and brought a disposable camera and took photographs that she printed at the drugstore and kept in an album on the coffee table. Nora went to Holyoke Community College on a Pell Grant and worked nights at a hospital cafeteria and called Gloria every Sunday. Gloria sent her care packages with homemade cookies and plantain chips, and, once, a small pot with a cutting from the fig tree, which Nora kept on her apartment windowsill, and which somehow, because some things are inherited, also survived. By her mid-20s, Nora had built a life that was modest but genuinely hers. She was good at her work, the community health outreach, the patient navigation, the task of helping people find their way through systems that had been designed without them in mind. She was good at it in the specific way that people who have themselves been inside difficult systems tend to be good at helping others navigate them. Not because of formal training, though she had that too, but because she understood from the inside how disorienting it was to be lost in a structure that everyone else seemed to find legible. She had a talent for sitting with people in the middle of confusion and not trying to resolve it too quickly. She had a talent for making people feel that their situation, however complicated, was not beyond the reach of help. She moved to Phoenix at 27 for a position with a larger organization, better resources, a broader scope of work, a city that had the particular quality of not knowing her, which at that point in her life felt like freedom rather than loss. She found an apartment near Camelback Mountain with a small balcony where she put the fig tree cutting in a bigger pot and where she sat most mornings before work, with coffee and whatever book she was reading. She made friends slowly, but kept them. She had a close circle of colleagues who became something closer than colleagues over time, the kind of friendships that form when people work hard at meaningful things together and take each other's company seriously. She did not talk about her past much, not because she was hiding it, but because she had come to think of it as a different country, a place she had once lived and that had shaped her and that she had left, and that did not require constant narration to remain part of who she was. The necklace she wore every day without thinking about it particularly. It was habit by now, the way wearing a watch becomes habit, something you notice only when it is not there. She did not know why she was drawn to it the day she saw it in the Goodwill case. She did not have an explanation for the way her eye went to it immediately among the other pieces, or for the feeling she had putting it on in the parking lot, which she would later describe to the journalist Marcus Dean as something between recognition and relief, as if she had picked up something she had put down a long time ago and forgotten she was still looking for. Marcus Dean was 34 years old, a staff investigative reporter at the Phoenix Gazette, and he had been covering financial crime and corporate misconduct for 6 years, with the particular tenacity that reporters who take their work seriously develop when they have spent enough time watching powerful people escape accountability through the simple mechanism of being powerful. He was not especially well known outside the reporting community. He had not broken a story that went national. He had broken several stories that should have gone national and had not, because the subjects of those stories were not famous enough, or the crimes were not dramatic enough to sustain the attention of the national press in its current condition. He was good at his job in the way that Carol Ashby was good at hers, methodically, patiently, without requiring the validation of public attention to continue. Marcus and Nora crossed paths for the first time, not in the Phoenix Gazette offices, and not because Marcus was investigating anything related to her. They were in the same community health meeting in October of the year before the hotel lobby incident, a city-level working group on housing instability and health outcomes that the Gazette's health reporter was supposed to cover but had a conflict for, and Marcus had been asked to step in and take notes. Nora gave a brief presentation on patient navigation barriers in the South Side Clinic network. Marcus listened, took his notes, and afterward approached her with a follow-up question about whether the barriers she described had any connection to documentation status issues he had seen in a separate story he was working on. They talked for 20 minutes in the parking lot after the meeting. They exchanged cards. They met for coffee twice over the following months, for background conversations on Marcus's story. They were not friends exactly, but they were the kind of professional acquaintances who trusted each other, people who had enough shared values and enough mutual respect to speak honestly when it mattered. Which is why, when Nora walked into the Sheraton Grand Phoenix on the morning of October the 8th for a Community Health Coalition breakfast that her organization was co-hosting, and a man across the lobby stared at her with an expression that she would later describe as something she had only ever seen on the faces of people receiving genuinely catastrophic news, and that man's security team approached her within 20 minutes with a polite but pointed request for her name and contact information, and that man's assistant called her cell phone the following morning to arrange a private meeting. When all of that happened in the space of 36 hours, the first person Nora called was Marcus Dean. She called him because she was not frightened, not exactly, but she was alert in the way she had learned to be alert, the way you learn when the floor has moved before and you have developed a sensitivity to the specific quality of stillness that precedes another movement. Something about the man across the lobby and the way he had looked at her had activated that sensitivity. She did not have a name for what she was feeling. She knew only that it was important, that it was connected to something she did not yet understand, and that she needed someone she trusted to help her figure out what it was. Marcus took the call at his desk. He listened to Nora describe what had happened: the lobby, the expression, the coffee cup, the security team, the phone call from the assistant. He asked her one question: "Do you know who the man is?" Nora said no. Marcus asked her to describe him. She described him. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he typed a name into a search engine and read the first result and was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Nora, I want you to do something for me. I want you to not respond to that call yet. I want to meet you today. I want to show you something." They met at a coffee shop near the clinic where Nora worked. Marcus brought his laptop and pulled up a news archive, a story from 11 years ago, out of Vermont, about a 9-year-old girl named Isabella Cole who had disappeared from her family's lake house over a weekend in June. He turned the laptop toward Nora and watched her read. He watched her face as she looked at the photograph that accompanied the story, a school photograph of a girl with dark brown, wide-set eyes and a determined jaw, wearing a uniform blazer and a half-moon necklace. He watched Nora's hand go, without any apparent conscious direction, to the pendant at her collarbone. She looked at him. She said, "That is my necklace." He said, "I know." She said, "Who is that girl?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is what we are going to find out." What happened next was not fast. The truth almost never is. It came in pieces, over weeks and then months, through records requests and database searches and phone calls made to people who had not expected to hear anyone asking these particular questions in a very long time. It came through a storage unit in Burlington, Vermont, and through a retired detective who kept a cardboard box on a closet shelf, and through a phone call that Carol Ashby received on a Wednesday morning in November from a number she did not recognize, that she almost did not answer, and that she would say later, sitting in a deposition room in Burlington 3 years after that morning, was the call she had been waiting 11 years to get. But before all of that, before the storage unit and the records and Carol Ashby's box on the shelf, there was a meeting, because Raymond Cole, when he could not make Nora Vasquez stop existing simply by wanting her to, did what Raymond Cole had always done when a problem resisted his first solution. He arranged a meeting. He flew back to Phoenix. He sent his assistant to contact Nora and request a private conversation, and Nora, on Marcus's advice, agreed to go. Wired, because Marcus had a contact at the Phoenix Police Department who owed him a favor, and because Marcus and Nora had both understood, by this point, that whatever Raymond Cole wanted to say to Nora in a private meeting was information they could not afford to miss. The meeting took place in a private dining room at a hotel in Scottsdale. Raymond arrived with 2 people his assistant described as associates, and that Nora recognized immediately as attorneys. He was dressed the way a man dresses when he wants to project that a situation is under control. Dark suit, no tie, the careful dishevelment of someone performing informality. He shook Nora's hand. He called her Ms. Vasquez. He sat down across the table from her and folded his hands and looked at her with an expression she would describe later, in Marcus's recorded interview with her, as the most frightening expression she had ever seen on a human face. Not because it was angry or threatening, because it was calculating. Because behind it, she said, there was the specific quality of focus that a person has when they are looking at a problem and measuring it, and she understood, sitting across from Raymond Cole in that private dining room in Scottsdale, that she was the problem being measured. He offered her $50,000 for the necklace. He called it a sentimental family piece of significant personal value. He said he had been searching for it for years. He said he understood she had no way of knowing its significance, and that he held no ill will, and that he simply wanted to restore it to the family. He said this smoothly and without hesitation and with enough practiced warmth that Nora thought, for a brief moment, that he might be telling the truth about something. Not about what the necklace meant to him, not about the search, but about something underneath all of it that was real, some actual human feeling beneath the machinery of the performance. Then she looked at his hands, still folded on the table, and she noticed that his knuckles were white. She told him she needed time to think about it. She thanked him for meeting with her. She stood up, shook his hand again, and walked out of the hotel and called Marcus from the parking lot and told him everything. And Marcus, who had been listening through the device his police contact had helped set up, had already heard it and was already running searches on Raymond Cole, on Cole Meridian Holdings, on the case of Isabella Cole out of Vermont, and on the particular question that had been sitting at the center of everything since the moment Nora's hand had gone to her collarbone in that coffee shop. The question was not whether Raymond Cole had done something. Marcus was already past that. The question was what he had done and who had helped him do it, and whether, after 11 years, enough of the machinery of it had survived to be found. The answer, as it turned out, was yes, because Raymond Cole had been precise and methodical and extraordinarily thorough. But he had made one mistake. He had assumed that the necklace was buried, and the necklace had not stayed buried. It had traveled through a storage unit and an estate sale and a picker's box and a glass case in a Goodwill in Springfield, Massachusetts, until it found the one person in the world for whom it was not simply a piece of jewelry, but a key. And keys, when they find their locks, do not ask for permission. They simply turn. Marcus Dean had been a reporter long enough to know that the most dangerous moment in any investigation is the moment it starts to feel easy, because it never is easy. What feels like a door swinging open is usually a hallway with more doors, and some of those doors are locked, and some of them open onto rooms you were not prepared for, and the ones that frighten experienced investigators the most are not the rooms with dramatic revelations in them, but the rooms that appear to contain nothing at all. Empty space, absent records, the particular silence of information that has been deliberately removed. Raymond Cole had spent 11 years and considerable resources making sure that the rooms were empty. What Marcus was about to discover was that the emptiness was not as complete as Raymond believed. The first thread came from the necklace itself, not from any laboratory analysis or forensic examination, Marcus was a journalist, not a law enforcement officer, and he did not have access to those tools without a case to attach them to. But from the straightforward question of where the necklace had been before the Goodwill in Springfield, put it in a glass case with a price tag of $3.99. Goodwill's donation intake process is not designed for detailed provenance tracking. Items arrive in bags and boxes and are sorted and priced by volunteers and staff who are moving quickly and do not, under ordinary circumstances, record where each individual item originated. But Goodwill stores in larger markets do maintain intake logs that record the date and general source category of donations: individual drop-off, corporate donation, estate liquidation, charity pickup. And Marcus, who had made enough public records requests in his career to understand which organizations kept what and how long they kept it, contacted the Springfield location and asked. The intake log for the week Nora's necklace arrived showed 3 estate liquidation donations in that period, bulk lots purchased at auction and donated by pickers and resellers who cleared estates and storage units for profit, and occasionally dropped excess merchandise at Goodwill rather than paying disposal fees. Marcus cross-referenced the dates with online auction records from estate sale companies operating in western Massachusetts and Vermont. This is not as complicated as it sounds. Estate auction records are increasingly digitized, and several of the major platforms that facilitate storage unit and estate sales maintain searchable archives. It took Marcus 4 days and a significant amount of coffee and the kind of methodical attention to tedious detail that separates good investigative reporters from people who merely aspire to be them before he found it. A lot entry from a Burlington, Vermont storage auction company showing a bulk contents sale for a unit designated ML114, registered to an entity called Meridian Asset Services LLC, auctioned 14 months after the account went delinquent. The lot purchased by a picker operating out of Northampton, Massachusetts, who had donated approximately 2 boxes of miscellaneous household goods to the Springfield Goodwill location 8 days after the auction. Meridian Asset Services LLC. Marcus ran the name. The corporate registration was in Delaware, a state whose business registration infrastructure is famously hospitable to entities that prefer a minimum of identifying information in their filings. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington that Marcus recognized from previous reporting as one that provided registered agent services to a significant number of shell entities without asking many questions about their beneficial owners. The LLC had been formed 9 years before the storage unit auction, which meant it had been formed approximately 2 years after Isabella Cole disappeared. It had no employees, no website, no public presence of any kind. Its tax filings, obtained through a request to the Delaware Division of Corporations, showed no income and no activity. A dormant entity, the kind that gets created for a specific purpose and then left to sit, accumulating minimal annual fees, until either the purpose is fulfilled or the fees go unpaid. Marcus looked at the name again. Meridian Asset Services, Cole Meridian Holdings. He had been a financial crime reporter long enough to understand that people who create shell entities for sensitive purposes sometimes make the mistake of encoding their connection in the name, not because they are careless, but because when you spend your professional life inside a particular nomenclature, it becomes automatic, the way a person who always names their passwords after their children continues to do so even after they have been told not to. He could not prove a connection from the name alone, but he noted it, the way he noted everything, in the margin of the yellow legal pad he kept beside his keyboard, for exactly this kind of marginal observation. Then he called the picker in Northampton. The picker's name was Dale Fitch, 57 years old, a veteran of 20-something years in the estate and storage auction business, who operated out of a converted barn on the edge of town that contained, at any given time, what he described as a controlled amount of chaos, and what a visitor might describe as an extraordinary volume of other people's former possessions, organized according to a system that was entirely legible to Dale and largely opaque to everyone else. In Marcus's experience, people who have spent their careers handling the physical remnants of other people's lives develop a particular relationship to narrative. They are naturally curious about where things come from and where they go, because that is the essential texture of the work, and a reporter asking questions about a specific lot from a specific auction several years back was, to Dale Fitch, simply another version of a conversation he had been having his entire adult life. Dale remembered the Burlington unit. He remembered it because it was unusual. Most storage units that go to auction contain the ordinary archaeology of interrupted lives: furniture, boxes of dishes, clothing, the accumulated material weight of ordinary American existence. The Burlington unit had contained almost exclusively personal effects belonging to a child. Books, clothing, school supplies, artwork, the kind of items that have no resale value, and that Dale, who had a granddaughter roughly the age the child's belongings suggested, had found quietly affecting in a way he had not been able to shake for some time afterward. He had kept a few of the books, nicer editions, the kind that could sell at a book fair, and had donated the rest because he did not feel right selling a child's things. He had not thought about it much after that, until Marcus called. Marcus asked Dale whether he remembered anything specific about the contents of the unit, anything that had struck him as particularly unusual beyond the general character of the items. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. He said there had been a sealed envelope in one of the boxes, a manila envelope, taped shut, with no markings on the outside. He said he had opened it, the way he opened everything, because you never knew what was in an envelope, and occasionally what was in an envelope was something valuable. He said what was inside the envelope was a piece of paper, not typed, not printed, handwritten. He said it appeared to be a letter. He said it was written in the handwriting of a child. He said it was addressed to someone's mama. Marcus asked Dale what he had done with the letter. Dale said he had put it back in the envelope and put it in a separate box that he had also donated to Goodwill because it was a child's letter to her mother and he was not going to put that in his barn alongside the auction inventory. Marcus asked Dale whether he still had any of the contents from that unit. Dale said the books he had kept were long gone, sold at a fair 2 seasons after the auction, but that he had taken photographs of the unit before he cleared it, the way he always did, for his own records. Marcus asked if he could send them. Dale sent 12 photographs. Marcus looked at them for a long time. The photographs showed a storage unit, approximately 10 feet by 20, with sealed cardboard boxes stacked in careful rows along both walls. Not haphazardly packed, carefully, deliberately, by someone who had taken the time to arrange things with intention. Marcus could see, in the box nearest the camera, the spines of several children's books, a rolled-up drawing that appeared to be a crayon landscape, and the edge of what might have been a school uniform blazer. He could see, in the background, a box with the word bedroom written on the side in black marker in an adult's handwriting. He could see, on top of one of the middle stacks, a small framed photograph face down, the wire hanger on the back visible. He sent the photographs to Nora and called her while she was looking at them. He heard her breathe. Then he heard the particular quality of silence that is not emptiness, but the opposite. The silence of a person who has been handed something so significant that their whole system pauses to accommodate it. Then she said, someone kept her things. They packed her things and paid for a storage unit and they kept everything she had, as if they thought she might come back for them someday. Marcus said, or as if they could not bring themselves to throw them away. He called Carol Ashby the following morning. Carol was 62 years old by then, retired from the Vermont State Police for 3 years, living in a house outside Burlington that she had bought with her pension and the proceeds from the sale of the larger house she had lived in during her marriage, which had ended, quietly and without acrimony, a decade earlier. She grew vegetables and read crime fiction and spent 2 mornings a week volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped low-income clients navigate small claims and housing disputes, which she found satisfying in the specific way that people who have spent their careers inside imperfect systems find satisfaction in using their expertise to help individuals navigate those systems more effectively. She was not bitter about her career. She was not one of those retired detectives who nursed a sense of accumulated grievance. She was, by her own description, a woman at peace with most things, except one case, one cardboard box, one set of facts that had never resolved themselves into an answer she could accept. Marcus identified himself. He told her he was investigating the disappearance of Isabella Cole. He told her about Nora, about the necklace, about the storage unit in Burlington. He told her about Dale Fitch, and the letter in the manila envelope, and the 12 photographs of carefully packed boxes. He told her about Raymond Cole in the Scottsdale hotel room, with his knuckles white under his folded hands, offering $50,000 for a piece of jewelry to a woman he had never met. Carol Ashby listened to all of it without interrupting. Marcus would say later that in 20-something years of making phone calls to sources and subjects and witnesses and experts, he had rarely heard someone listen the way Carol Ashby listened, not passively, not restlessly, but with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific set of words and is verifying, in real time, that the words they are hearing are those words. When Marcus finished, there was a silence of about 10 seconds. Then Carol said, I have a box I need to show you. When can you get to Burlington? Marcus booked a flight for the following Tuesday. In the days between, he filed a records request with the Vermont Department of Children and Families for placement records associated with any child admitted to the foster care system from Chittenden County, the county that includes Burlington and the surrounding area, in the weeks immediately following Isabella Cole's disappearance. This is the kind of records request that takes time under ordinary circumstances, and considerably more time when the records in question involve a minor and the specific child's identity is uncertain. Marcus was not expecting a quick answer. What he got, 3 weeks after the request was filed, was a response from the department's public records officer informing him that records matching his request parameters had been identified, but that their release required a court order due to the minor's age at the time of placement and the confidentiality provisions of Vermont child welfare law. He noted this. He moved on to what he could access. The storage unit registration was a matter of public record once he had the LLC name and the unit number, and he obtained the account history through the storage company, which showed that Meridian Asset Services LLC had rented unit ML114 for 11 years. From approximately 8 months after Isabella's disappearance until the account went delinquent, paying the monthly fee consistently by automatic bank transfer from an account that, when Marcus traced it as far as he legally could without law enforcement assistance, resolved to a subsidiary of an entity whose ultimate beneficial ownership was not publicly disclosed. The chain was long. It was designed to be long. But the fact that someone had rented that unit and paid for it consistently for over a decade meant something that Marcus turned over in his mind for several days before he articulated it clearly enough to write down. It was not a disposal. Whoever had packed those boxes and stored them had not been trying to erase Isabella's existence. They had been preserving it. They had been keeping her things against some future possibility, a return, a reunion, a moment that never came, paying month after month for over a decade for the right to hold on to what remained of a child who had been made to disappear. Marcus did not know, sitting with that observation, whether it made what had been done better or worse. He thought it probably made it worse, because it suggested that the person or people responsible had not been able to fully commit to the erasure. They had taken a child and made her into someone else, and paid the machinery of that making to keep the secret. And then they had rented a storage unit, and packed her things with care, and paid for it, year after year, as if at some level, they were unable to let go of the possibility that Isabella Cole still existed somewhere, and might someday need her things back. That is not the behavior of a person who feels nothing. That is the behavior of a person who feels a great deal and has spent a long time learning how to perform feeling nothing, which is a different and in some ways considerably darker condition. He flew to Burlington on a Tuesday morning in November and drove to Carol Ashby's house in a rental car through a light snowfall that made the roads slick and the trees along the highway look like something from a different century. Carol met him at the door in a fleece vest and reading glasses pushed up on her head and walked him directly to her home office without offering coffee first, which Marcus interpreted correctly as the gesture of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation and did not want to spend time on preliminaries. The cardboard box was already on her desk. She walked him through it methodically. The camera system report, the technical finding that the power connection had been manually severed, the documentation of the junction box access, the timeline showing the interruption began at 9:52 p.m., on Saturday night, hours before Raymond Cole called 911. The phone records showing the call to Stephen Vance at 7:23 in the morning, 36 minutes after the 911 call, before any law enforcement officer had spoken to Raymond. The parallel shoes, the necklace on the post, the anonymous tip transcript with her handwritten note in the margin, present tense. The file on the federal attorney who had appeared at the precinct to advise coordination 48 hours into the investigation. She had a name for that attorney, a name she had obtained through channels she described as informal, and that she had kept because she believed it would eventually become useful. Then she pulled out one more item, a photograph she had taken herself, with her own camera, on the second day of the investigation, before the formal scene documentation was complete. It showed the dock from the lawn side, looking toward the water. In the foreground was the dock post with the necklace hanging on it. In the background, slightly out of focus, was the edge of the boathouse, and on the boathouse wall, visible if you knew to look for it, was the open junction box. The cover swung outward, the wires inside disturbed, as clear as anything once you understood what you were seeing. She had taken this photograph because something about the junction box had caught her eye, and she had not wanted to flag it officially until she understood what she was looking at. By the time she understood what she was looking at, the Federal Coordination Advisory had arrived, and she had put the photograph in her personal files and kept it there. She handed the photograph to Marcus. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "You have been sitting on this for 11 years. Carol said, "I have been keeping it safe for 11 years. There is a difference." She said it the way a person says something they have said to themselves many times, in the privacy of their own reasoning, testing it against their own conscience, finding it still standing. Marcus did not argue the point. He photographed every document in the box with his phone and drove back to his hotel in the light snowfall and sat at the desk in his room for 3 hours going through what he had. He called Nora that evening. He told her that what Carol Ashby had kept in that box was not enough on its own to prove what had happened to Isabella Cole. It was investigative material, not evidence in any current legal proceeding, but that it was enough to support a story, If the story was framed correctly and sourced carefully, that would make it extremely difficult for Raymond Cole's legal team to continue operating in the comfortable ambient silence they had relied on for 11 years. He told her that the decision to publish was ultimately not his alone. It was his editor's decision and the paper's legal team's decision, but that his intention was to pursue the story as far as it would go. He asked Nora if she understood what that meant for her. He asked if she was ready for what happened when a story like this became public. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been living inside someone else's silence my whole life. I think I am ready for some noise." Marcus went back to Phoenix and began writing. He wrote carefully and slowly, and checked every fact against every document multiple times, because the subject of the story was a man with $4 billion and a legal team whose entire professional existence was organized around making stories like this one disappear. And Marcus understood that the only protection he had against that machine was the kind of sourcing that the machine could not discredit without discrediting itself. He wrote for 3 weeks. He sent drafts to his editor, a woman named Patricia Owens, who had been in the business for 30 years, and who read his drafts with a red pen and no sentimentality, and sent them back with questions that forced him to be more precise about every claim he was making and why he was making it. They went back and forth for 2 weeks after the drafts began. They brought in the paper's attorney. They made 37 individual fact-checking calls. Before the first story ran, Raymond Cole's attorney, Stephen Vance, sent the Phoenix Gazette a letter threatening litigation if the paper published any story that made claims about Raymond Cole or Cole Meridian Holdings that were not supported by verifiable evidence. The paper's attorney responded. The correspondence continued for several days. The editor held the story for 1 additional week, while the legal review was completed. And then, on a Thursday morning in late January, the first story went live on the Gazette's website, under Marcus Dean's byline, with a headline that read, "Who is Nora Vasquez, and why does a billionaire want her necklace?" By noon that day, it had been shared 40,000 times. By the following morning, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. And in a federal building in Washington, D.C., in an office on the 4th floor, where a grand jury had been quietly convening for the better part of a year, on a matter described in court filings as United States sealed, a DOJ attorney named Kevin Hargrove read the story on his phone during his lunch break and then read it again, and then picked up his desk phone and made a call to a colleague that began, "Have you seen the Phoenix Gazette this morning? Because I think we just found our pressure point." The story had pulled the first thread. What came unraveling next would take another 8 months. A storage unit warrant, a grant of immunity, a deathbed letter, and a trial that would fill a federal courthouse in Burlington, Vermont for 11 weeks. But it began, as most unravelings do, not with a dramatic confrontation or a decisive piece of evidence, but with a woman who refused to sell a necklace for $50,000, because it was hers, because she had always felt that it was hers, because some part of her that she did not yet have the words to name had known, from the moment she put it on in a Goodwill parking lot in Springfield, Massachusetts, that taking it off was not something she was willing to do. Kevin Hargrove had been with the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division for 19 years, and in that time he had learned to recognize the particular quality of momentum that a dormant investigation develops when something external shifts the conditions around it. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is more like the change in a room's air pressure before weather moves in, a subtle alteration in the texture of what is possible that an experienced person can feel before they can name it. Kevin had felt it twice before in his career, on cases that had stalled for years before a single new piece of information changed the angle of approach and made everything that had previously been immovable suddenly capable of being moved. He felt it the morning he read Marcus Dean's story about Nora Vasquez and the necklace and the billionaire who wanted it back for $50,000 in a private dining room in Scottsdale. The grand jury that had been convening in Washington on the matter of Cole Meridian Holdings had been doing so, quietly and without public disclosure, for 11 months. The investigation that had generated it stretched back further, to the original audit flag that Thomas Briggs had raised years earlier, to the slow accumulation of billing records and internal communications and financial flows that had been assembled, with the patience of people who understand that white-collar fraud cases are not built in days or weeks but in years, layer by careful layer, until the structure is solid enough that a defendant's legal team cannot dismantle it by attacking individual components. The grand jury had heard testimony from 14 witnesses. It had reviewed thousands of documents. What it had not yet produced was an indictment, because Kevin Hargrove and his colleagues had been waiting for the piece that would convert a strong financial fraud case into something that a jury of ordinary Americans could understand viscerally, not just intellectually, not just as a matter of numbers and billing codes and procurement regulations, but as a human story with a human cost. The story of Nora Vasquez was that piece. Kevin understood this within 20 minutes of reading it. A defense contractor fraud case, however well documented and however large the dollar amounts involved, asks a jury to engage with systems and abstractions, procurement regulations, billing structures, shell entities, financial flows across layers of corporate architecture. Juries can do this. Juries do it all the time. But the most powerful financial fraud cases are the ones where the abstraction resolves into a face, into a person who can sit in a courtroom and make the harm real to 12 people who have never thought about defense procurement in their lives. Kevin Hargrove had not had that person. He had numbers. He had documents. He had the testimony of former Cole Meridian employees who had seen things and had been carefully coached by their own attorneys about how precisely to describe what they had seen. What he had not had was a 9-year-old girl. He called his supervisor. He called the lead case attorney. He called the DOJ attorney who had appeared at the Vermont State Police Precinct 11 years ago to advise coordination. A man named Gerald Whitfield, who was by now a partner at a private firm in Washington, but whose involvement in the original situation was documented in Carol Ashby's files, and who, Kevin suspected, had a decision to make about how much of that involvement he was willing to disclose voluntarily versus how much he preferred to have disclosed for him. These were delicate conversations, and Kevin had them with the care of someone who understands that in an investigation of this size and sensitivity, the manner in which you approach the people around the edges of a case determines whether those people become cooperative witnesses or defensive obstacles. He made no threats. He asked questions. He listened carefully to what people said and what they did not say, and he noted both with equal attention. Within 3 weeks of Marcus's first story running, the DOJ's investigation into Cole Meridian had formally expanded to include the circumstances of Isabella Cole's disappearance and the allegation, not yet proven, not yet even formally alleged, but present in the public record and now present in the grand jury's scope of inquiry, that Raymond Cole had used the same network of shell entities and private facilitators that had supported the defense contractor fraud to engineer his daughter's disappearance from his life and her insertion into the foster care system under a false identity. This was not a small expansion. It transformed the case from a sophisticated financial fraud prosecution into something that the press, once they understood the full shape of it, would have considerable difficulty describing in terms that did justice to its actual character. The Vermont Department of Children and Families, in response to a federal grand jury subpoena that superseded the public records law limitations that had slowed Marcus's earlier request, produced the placement records for Nora Vasquez within 2 weeks. The records were reviewed by federal investigators and by the DOJ team alongside a forensic document examiner who had spent her career authenticating and identifying fraudulent official documents. Her assessment of the Nora Vasquez placement file took 4 days. Her report, which became part of the grand jury record and was later introduced at trial, ran to 61 pages. Its conclusion, stated in the precise and qualified language of expert forensic analysis, was that the documentation establishing Nora Vasquez's identity and her entry into the Vermont foster care system showed signs of construction rather than organic generation. That is, the documents had been created to represent a history rather than to record one. Specific irregularities included date sequencing anomalies in the birth record, inconsistencies in the administrative processing timestamps that suggested documents had been generated in a compressed time window rather than over the years they purported to span, and a signature on one intake form that, upon analysis, appeared to have been applied via a mechanical process rather than signed by hand. The foster care system, it should be said, is not designed to detect this kind of fraud. It is designed to process children who need placement, often under time pressure, often with incomplete documentation, often in circumstances where the priority is the child's immediate safety rather than exhaustive verification of their paperwork. The people who had processed Nora's placement had done nothing wrong. They had worked with what they were given. What they had been given was a fabrication assembled by professionals, and the professionals had done their work well enough that it had survived routine inspection for over a decade. It had not survived forensic scrutiny, but forensic scrutiny had never been applied because no one had had a reason to apply it, until a necklace turned up in a hotel lobby on a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, and a man's coffee cup hit a marble floor. The DNA confirmation came 6 weeks after the grand jury subpoena was issued. Nora provided a voluntary sample. The DOJ had obtained a reference sample from a source that the investigation records describe only as a legally authorized biological comparator. The specifics of how this sample was obtained remain under seal as part of the case record, and were not disclosed in the public proceedings, though legal analysts following the trial speculated that it derived from biological material associated with Diana Cole, Nora's mother, that had been preserved as part of a separate estate proceeding years earlier. The comparison was conducted by an independent forensic laboratory under chain of custody protocols that Raymond Cole's defense team would later attempt to challenge and fail to successfully undermine. The result was unambiguous. The woman known as Nora Vasquez shared sufficient biological markers with the reference sample to establish, to a scientific certainty that the laboratory expressed as greater than 99.9%, that she was the biological daughter of Diana Cole, which meant she was Isabella Cole, which meant that Isabella Cole had not drowned in Whitaker Lake 11 years ago, which meant that Raymond Cole had filed a false police report, had allowed an 11-day search of a lake for a child he knew to be alive, had allowed the diversion of state and federal search resources for a disappearance he had engineered, and had spent 11 years publicly presenting himself as a grieving father while privately paying to maintain the infrastructure of a lie. The moment Nora received the DNA results, she was sitting in Marcus's office at the Phoenix Gazette. He had been present, at her request, because she had told him she did not want to be alone when the call came and that she trusted him more than anyone else currently involved in the situation to simply sit there and not make it into something it did not need to be made into. The DOJ attorney who called her was not Kevin Hargrove, but a victim liaison named Sandra Okafor, a woman whose specific role in the department was to communicate sensitive findings to individuals at the center of investigations in a way that prioritized their well-being and their comprehension before any procedural considerations. Sandra Okafor told Nora what the results showed. She explained what it meant legally. She told Nora that the department had resources available to her: counseling, legal representation, advocacy support, and that nothing would be required of her without her full understanding and consent at every step. Nora thanked Sandra Okafor. She ended the call. She sat in the chair across from Marcus's desk for what Marcus later described as about 3 minutes without speaking. Marcus did not speak either. He had learned, over the months of working with Nora, that she processed things in the particular way that people who have spent their lives inside difficult circumstances learn to process them, fully, internally, without performance, and that the most useful thing he could do during those silences was be present without filling them. After about 3 minutes, Nora said, "So my name is Isabella." She said it the way a person says something they are testing in their mouth for the first time, feeling its shape, determining whether it fits. Then she said, "I do not think I am going to use it." Marcus said, "You do not have to use it," she said. "I know." She looked at the pendant at her collarbone. She said, "But I want to understand what happened to her. Even if she is me, I want to understand what happened to her. Because no one ever explained it to her, and she deserved an explanation." The explanation came in pieces over the following months, assembled from the expanding grand jury investigation, from the documents recovered from the storage unit after a federal warrant was executed, from the forensic accounting work that traced the financial flows connecting Raymond Cole, Meridian Asset Services LLC, the private facilitators, and the false identity construction, and ultimately from the testimony of the person who had been closest to the execution of the plan, and who, faced with the accumulated weight of what the DOJ had assembled, made the decision that she had always told herself she would not make, if it ever came to this, and then made it anyway, because the alternative was to go to prison for the rest of what remained of a life she had spent in considerable comfort at considerable cost. And Claire Beaumont Cole, whatever else she was a woman who had always been extraordinarily clear-eyed about the calculation between cost and benefit. Claire's attorney contacted the DOJ 14 weeks after Marcus's first story ran. The immunity negotiation took 6 weeks. What Claire agreed to provide in exchange for immunity from prosecution, testimony about the planning and execution of Isabella's disappearance, took another 3 months to fully document in the depositions, and prepared statements that the DOJ required before the immunity agreement was finalized. What she described in those depositions became the foundation of the government's case, and also the clearest account that exists of what actually happened inside the Cole household in the weeks between Rosa Jimenez's disclosure to Claire and the morning at Whitaker Lake when everything was set in motion. Claire said that when Rosa told her what Isabella had seen in Raymond's office, she had told Raymond that same evening. She said Raymond's response was not panic. It was never panic with Raymond, she said. And you could hear in the deposition transcripts something that her attorney would describe as residual respect, and what a careful reader might identify as something closer to residual terror. His response was analysis. He considered the situation. He identified the variables. He assessed the risk, and he concluded, within the space of a conversation that lasted less than an hour, that a 9-year-old child, who had seen documents she could not understand, but could describe, and would eventually be able to describe to people who could understand them, was a variable that needed to be resolved. He did not discuss it with Claire in those terms, she said. He discussed it in the language of protection, that Isabella would be safer somewhere else, that the situation with the DOJ was becoming complicated, that there were people who might use Isabella to get to him, and that he could not allow that to happen. Claire said she had believed some of this, in the beginning. She said she had not believed that the arrangement would be permanent. She said she had understood it as temporary, a few months, perhaps a year, until the federal situation resolved itself, and then Isabella would come home. She said she had told herself this for years. She said at some point she had stopped believing it and kept telling herself anyway, which she recognized, in the flat and careful language of the deposition, as something she was not going to ask anyone to forgive. The facilitator Raymond had called, the man with the number that had been kept in a separate phone in a drawer, was a former private intelligence operative named, in the federal indictment, as Arthur Greer. Greer had spent 15 years doing work that the federal government had once found useful, and had then found inconvenient, and had eventually found prosecutable, and he had spent the subsequent years applying his particular skill set to private clients, with problems that required solutions outside the conventional range of options available to ordinary people. He had constructed identities before. He had moved children before. Not in this context, not at a parent's direction for this purpose, but the mechanics of creating a documented identity for a person who needed to become someone else were not meaningfully different regardless of the specifics, and Raymond Cole paid extremely well. Greer arranged everything in 72 hours, the identity documents, the caseworker contact, a woman in the Vermont system who had a debt that Greer held and who processed Nora's placement without asking the questions she should have asked. The transfer from the Lake House property to the Springfield placement in an unmarked vehicle driven by a man whose name appears in the federal indictment, but not in this story, because he cooperated with prosecutors early and fully, and his cooperation was part of how so much of the rest of the structure was ultimately mapped and understood. The carefully packed boxes that were delivered to the storage unit, the monthly payments that kept the unit current for 11 years. That last detail, the monthly payments, the 11 years of keeping her things, was something that Claire, in her deposition, said she had insisted on. She said she had told Raymond that she would not agree to the arrangement unless Isabella's belongings were kept. She said she had believed, for a long time, that this made her less culpable than she would otherwise have been. She said she was no longer sure she believed that. She said it with the specific flatness of a person who has spent considerable time in the company of a truth they do not like and have learned to stop arguing with. Before we go further, we want to hear from you. Drop your city or state in the comments section right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to the story. The DOJ filed its indictment on a Tuesday morning, nearly a year after Marcus's first story ran. Raymond Cole was indicted on 6 counts. 2 counts of making false statements to federal investigators, 1 count of obstruction of justice related to the original Vermont investigation, 1 count of fraud against the United States government in connection with the Cole Meridian defense contractor scheme, 1 count of child abandonment under a federal statute that applied, given the cross-state elements of the placement, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit identity fraud. The indictment ran to 44 pages. It named Raymond Cole, Arthur Greer, and 2 additional individuals associated with Greer's operation. It referenced Claire Beaumont Cole as a cooperating witness throughout. It referenced the caseworker who had processed Nora's placement as an unindicted co-conspirator, a designation that ended her career and resulted in a separate administrative proceeding that stripped her of her professional license. Raymond Cole was arrested at his Connecticut estate on a Tuesday morning at 6:45 a.m. by federal agents who arrived in 4 vehicles and who served the arrest warrant and the accompanying search warrants simultaneously. The search warrants covering the estate, the Cole Meridian offices in Hartford, and a secondary residence in Palm Beach that Raymond had purchased 3 years earlier and that the DOJ suspected contained additional relevant financial records. His attorney Stephen Vance was on the phone with him within minutes. Vance later said Raymond had called him from the back seat of the federal vehicle, composed, instructing Vance to file for bail immediately and to prepare a public statement that characterized the charges as politically motivated overreach. The statement was issued by Vance's office before noon. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, every major outlet in the country had the indictment, the statement, and the backstory, the missing daughter, the necklace, the goodwill in Springfield, the woman who had refused $50,000 to give it back. Nora Vasquez learned about the arrest from Marcus, who called her before the news broke publicly. She was at work. She stepped out of a patient navigation meeting to take the call and stood in the hallway of the clinic for the duration of it, listening to Marcus walk her through what had happened and what came next, and what the DOJ's victim liaison had told him she could expect in the coming days. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it strange that I do not feel what I thought I would feel?" Marcus said, "What did you think you would feel?" She said, "I thought I would feel like something was over. But it does not feel like something is over. It feels like something is about to begin." Marcus said, "It is." She said, "I know." She went back into the meeting and picked up exactly where she had left off, because she was Nora Vasquez. She was also Isabella Cole, yes. And she was still in the process of understanding what that meant. But she was Nora Vasquez first. And Nora Vasquez showed up. And the patients waiting in that clinic needed someone to show up for them. And no arrest, no indictment, no national news story was going to change what she knew about what mattered and what did not. The trial was scheduled to begin 11 months after the indictment. In the time between, Raymond Cole's legal team filed 4 motions to dismiss, 2 motions challenging the admissibility of key evidence, a motion to change venue, and a motion challenging the constitutionality of the federal child abandonment statute as applied to the specific circumstances of the case. All were denied. Raymond was released on a $50 million bond secured against his Connecticut estate. He was fitted with a monitoring bracelet. He was required to surrender his passport. He lived in his estate and made no public statements, and fired 2 members of his legal team and hired replacements, and continued to behave, by all external accounts, with the composure of a man who believed that the outcome was still something he could control. Arthur Greer, who did not have Raymond Cole's resources or Raymond Cole's composure, pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges 8 months into the pre-trial period in exchange for a reduced sentence and his cooperation with the government's case. Greer's cooperation produced 3 things that Kevin Hargrove would later describe as the 3 load-bearing pillars of the prosecution: the name of the caseworker who had processed Nora's placement, the financial documentation tracing the shell entity payments to their ultimate source in Raymond Cole's personal accounts, and a recorded conversation. A phone call between Greer and Raymond made approximately 6 weeks after Isabella's disappearance, which Greer had recorded himself and kept as, in his words, professional insurance, in which Raymond asked Greer whether everything was settled, and Greer said yes, and Raymond said good, and then said, after a pause, that the transcript marks as lasting approximately 4 seconds, "She is safe where she is. She will be taken care of," Greer said. "That is what you want me to tell people?" Raymond said, "That is what I want it to be." Greer said nothing. Raymond ended the call. Kevin Hargrove listened to that recording 12 times before the trial. He listened to it the way Carol Ashby had listened to the anonymous tip call 11 years ago. Not for new information, because by the time he first heard it, he already knew everything it contained, but for the quality of what it revealed about the man he was prosecuting. She is safe where she is. She will be taken care of. Raymond Cole had made a 9-year-old child disappear and inserted her into a system where no one knew who she was, or what had been done to her, or why, and 6 weeks later, in a phone call with the man he had paid to arrange it, he had described this as taking care of her. Kevin Hargrove, who had been a federal prosecutor for 19 years and who was not given to dramatic statements, said to his colleague after the 12th listen, "I want to play that for the jury first, before any documents, before any witnesses, just that. Because everything else we need to prove is already in those 8 words, if you understand what they mean." He was right, but understanding what they meant, the full meaning of those 8 words, the full weight of what Raymond Cole had decided to do, and why, and at what cost, to the person he had decided to do it to, required the jury to hear from Nora Vasquez. And Nora Vasquez, who had spent her whole life being defined by things that had been done to her without her knowledge or consent, had decided that this time she was going to define it herself. She was going to walk into that courtroom and sit in the witness chair and look at the jury and tell them exactly who she was and exactly what had been taken from her. Not to perform grief, not to generate sympathy, but to make sure that 12 people understood, with complete clarity, what it cost a human being to have their name, their history, and their identity erased by the person who was supposed to protect those things above everything else. She had been preparing for that testimony for months. She had been preparing for it, in a sense, for her entire life. The federal courthouse in Burlington, Vermont, is a 4-story brick building on Cherry Street that was constructed in 1858 and has the particular quality of solidity that old civic buildings carry. Not grandeur exactly, but permanence. The suggestion that the institution housed inside has outlasted a great many things and intends to outlast a great many more. On the Monday morning that Raymond Cole's trial began, there was a line outside the building before 7 o'clock. The courtroom seats 90 people. There were more than 300 outside wanting to get in. Federal marshals managed the line with the practiced patience of people who have seen this before and know that the energy of public attention is most useful when it is acknowledged and most dangerous when it is ignored. By 8:30, every seat in the courtroom was filled, and the overflow was directed to a room 2 floors down, where the proceedings would be broadcast on a monitor. And that room filled too, and people stood in the hallway outside it, because the hallway was the closest they could get, and they had come too far to go home. Raymond Cole arrived in a black SUV with his legal team at 8:47. He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit and a tie the color of old paper. and he walked from the vehicle to the courthouse entrance with the measured stride of a man who has decided that the camera is a tool and that how you move through a frame is information you are choosing to provide. His lead attorney, a woman named Catherine Marsh, whom he had brought in from a white-collar criminal defense firm in New York after firing the previous two, walked beside him and said nothing to the cameras and directed nothing at Raymond with her expression because she was a professional and she understood that the walk from the car to the door was a performance that her client needed to give without direction. Raymond did not look at the cameras. He looked straight ahead. He looked like a man walking into a building he owned. He did not own this building. That was perhaps the most significant thing that had changed in Raymond Cole's life over the course of the year since the indictment. He did not own this building, and he did not own the process that was about to unfold inside it, and he did not own the jury of 12 people drawn from the ordinary population of Chittenden County, who had no investment in his reputation, or his empire, or his version of events, and he could not buy the outcome the way he had bought so many outcomes over the course of a 40-year career, built on the premise that enough resources applied with sufficient precision could resolve any problem. He had applied resources. He had applied them extensively, and at extraordinary cost over the preceding year, and he was still here, in a charcoal suit, walking into a federal courthouse in Burlington, Vermont, on a cold Monday morning in February, because some problems are not susceptible to the application of resources no matter how many resources you have. Kevin Hargrove's opening statement lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. He began, as he had told his colleague he intended to begin, with the recording. He did not preface it. He did not explain it. He stood before the jury and said, "I am going to play you an 8-second audio recording. I want you to listen to it carefully, because everything you hear over the next 11 weeks will be an elaboration of what these 8 seconds mean." And then he played it. Raymond Cole's voice, flat and controlled in the way it was always flat and controlled, saying, "She is safe where she is. She will be taken care of." And then the silence, where Greer had said nothing. And then the call ending. Kevin let the silence after the recording sit for a moment, before he spoke again. He said, "That recording was made approximately 6 weeks after Raymond Cole reported his 9-year-old daughter missing and possibly drowned in Whitaker Lake, Vermont. At the time he made that call, he had allowed the Vermont State Police to search that lake for 11 days. He had allowed search and rescue volunteers to comb the surrounding woods. He had allowed the diversion of state and federal resources for an investigation into a disappearance that he himself had engineered. He had stood before cameras and said his daughter was his whole world and he would not rest until there were answers. And 6 weeks after all of that, he called the man he had paid to make his daughter disappear, and he said, "She is safe where she is. She will be taken care of." Kevin Hargrove paused. He said, "The government will prove to you over the course of this trial that Raymond Cole knew exactly where his daughter was, because he had sent her there. The government will prove that he did this not out of fear, not out of confusion, not out of any of the explanations his attorneys will offer you, but out of calculation. The same kind of cold, systematic calculation that he applied to defrauding the United States government of $340 million over 6 years. And when you have heard everything the government will present, we believe you will conclude, as we have concluded, that Raymond Cole treated his own daughter the way he treated every other problem in his life, as a liability to be managed." Catherine Marsh's opening statement was 53 minutes long and considerably more difficult to deliver than Kevin Hargrove's, because she was working with material that the facts of the case had made almost impossible to present sympathetically. She did not try to present it sympathetically. She tried to present it as complicated, which is the more sophisticated move when sympathy is unavailable, because complicated asks a jury to hold ambiguity rather than reach a verdict, and doubt, reasonable doubt, is all a defense attorney ultimately needs. She argued that the evidence of Raymond's intent was circumstantial, that the recorded phone call was consistent with a father who had made a terrible decision under extreme duress and was attempting to reassure himself that his child was being cared for, that the financial fraud case and the disappearance of Isabella Cole were being presented as connected when the connection was, in fact, asserted by the prosecution rather than proven. She was good. She was very good. Several of the legal analysts who had been following the case since the indictment said she gave one of the best opening statements they had seen in a complex federal case in recent memory. It did not matter in the end, but she gave it anyway, because that is what you do when you are a professional, and you have taken a case, and you believe, on some level, that the system requires a rigorous defense even for people who have done what Raymond Cole had done, because the system does not function without that rigor, and she was, whatever else could be said about her choices in this particular case, a person who believed in the system. The government called 18 witnesses over 7 weeks. The forensic document examiner who had analyzed Nora's placement records. The forensic accountant who had traced the financial flows from Raymond's personal accounts through the shell entity chain to the monthly storage unit payments. The DNA expert who explained the biological confirmation in language the jury could follow without a science background. Dale Fitch, the picker from Northampton, who described the Burlington storage unit and the child's letter in the manila envelope in the particular plain-spoken way of a man who has nothing to gain from embellishment and whose very ordinariness makes him the kind of witness that juries find credible without being able to fully explain why. Gerald Mast, 82 years old by then, frail but precise, who described the voices he had heard from the main house on Saturday night 11 years ago, the raised adult voices and underneath them, once, a child's voice, high and sharp in a way he recognized as distress, and who described his decision to go back to sleep and the weight of that decision in the years since, with a directness that left the courtroom very quiet. Carol Ashby, who presented her 11 years of kept files with the methodical precision of a person who has been rehearsing this testimony in her mind for over a decade, and who answered Catherine Marsh's cross-examination with the specific unflappable quality of someone who has heard every possible objection to their position and has already answered it to their own satisfaction. And Arthur Greer, who testified for 2 full days, who described in operational detail the construction of Nora's identity and the mechanics of her transfer and the financial arrangements that had sustained the secret, and who answered Catherine Marsh's sustained and aggressive cross-examination by simply telling the same story in the same sequence with the same details every time she asked him to tell it again from a different angle, because the story was true, and true stories do not change when you approach them from different angles. They only become more detailed, and the detail was the thing that Catherine Marsh had been trying to create doubt around, and detail is the one weapon that doubt cannot survive. Kevin Hargrove called Nora Vasquez as the government's final witness on a Thursday morning in the 7th week of the trial. She wore a dark blue dress and no jewelry. She had decided, after thinking about it for several days, not to wear the necklace. She would explain this decision later, in a written piece she published several months after the verdict, by saying that the necklace had done its work. It had found her, it had led her here, it had opened the door that 11 years of silence had kept shut, and that walking into the courtroom wearing it felt like using her mother as a prop, which was not something she was willing to do. She wanted to walk in as herself. She wanted the jury to see Nora Vasquez, the woman she had built from nothing, from a backpack and 3 changes of clothes and a library book she had never returned, without the artifact that had made her findable. She was findable now. She had been found. The necklace could rest. She took the oath and sat down and looked at the jury, and did not look at Raymond Cole. She had decided this too, in advance. She would not look at him. Not because she was afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him since the Scottsdale meeting, when she had seen his white knuckles under his folded hands and understood that she was the thing he was afraid of, not the other way around, but because she had decided that her testimony was for the jury and for the record and for Isabella Cole, who had never gotten an explanation, and it was not for Raymond. He had already had enough of her attention over the course of her life. He was not going to have any more of it in that courtroom. Kevin Hargrove asked her to describe her earliest memories. She described them. She described the house she had lived in before Springfield. The house she did not know was her own house, the rooms she could recall in fragments, a kitchen with yellow curtains, a backyard with a stone path, a woman who smelled like lavender who held her hand when they crossed streets. She described the necklace, how she had known from very early in her life that it was the most important thing she owned, and that she could not have explained why, only that the weight of it against her collarbone felt like proof of something she could not name. She described the morning she found herself in the back seat of a car she did not recognize, being told that there had been a family situation and that she was going somewhere safe, and the specific quality of the light coming through the car window that morning, which she described as the way light looks when something has already ended and you have not been told yet. She described the Henderson house and the 3 other placements and Gloria Reyes and the garden and the fig tree cutting on the windowsill in Phoenix. She described the Goodwill in Springfield and the glass case and the $4 necklace and the feeling of putting it on in the parking lot. She described the hotel lobby and the man across the room and his coffee cup falling and the way he looked at her, not with grief, not with the expression of a father seeing a ghost, but with the specific, contracted alertness of a man encountering a threat and beginning immediately to calculate his response to it. She described the Scottsdale meeting and the $50,000 and his knuckles white under his folded hands. She described the phone call from the DOJ victim liaison and the 3 minutes of silence in Marcus Dean's office, and the moment she said her name was Isabella, out loud for the first time since she was 9 years old, and how it had felt like something that belonged to someone else, a garment that had been altered for a different body, and that she was not sure she could wear anymore. She described what it had cost her, not in the dramatic terms of loss and injustice, though both were present, but in the ordinary, specific terms of the actual daily texture of a life built without a foundation. The confusion in school when forms asked for family history, and she did not have answers. The particular loneliness of holidays in houses that were kind but not hers. The habit, developed so early she could not remember developing it, of not investing too much in any one place or person because she had learned at 9 years old that the floor could move. The work it had taken. The years of quiet, unglamorous, daily work to build something solid enough to stand on despite all of that. She spoke for 4 hours and 20 minutes. She did not cry. She did not perform anything. She answered every question Kevin Hargrove put to her with the same clear, direct attention she brought to everything. The attention of a woman who had decided a long time ago that the only honest response to a difficult reality was to look at it straight and describe it accurately, and that neither softening it nor dramatizing it served the truth in any useful way. When Catherine Marsh cross-examined her, attempting to establish that Nora had no direct knowledge of Raymond Cole's intent in the events surrounding her placement, Nora acknowledged this plainly. She said, "I cannot tell you what was in his mind. I can only tell you what was done to me and what it cost." Catherine Marsh had no useful follow-up to that. She said, "No further questions." She said it in the tone of someone who has just understood, too late, that the witness was never a problem they could solve. Raymond Cole took the stand in the 9th week of the trial. His testimony lasted 3 days. He was composed, as he was always composed, and he told the story he had been preparing to tell. A story of a frightened father, a complicated investigation, a decision made in crisis that had spiraled beyond anything he had intended. He said he had feared for Isabella's safety because of threats he had received. Threats he could not substantiate, because, he said, he had destroyed the communications out of fear. He said he had believed the arrangement with Greer was temporary. He said he had been wrong, and that the wrongness of it had been a weight he had carried for 11 years. He said he was sorry. He said it looking at the jury, not at Nora, who was sitting in the gallery by then, watching him with the same steady attention she brought to everything. He said he loved his daughter, and that not a day had passed in 11 years that he had not thought of her. On Kevin Hargrove's cross-examination, Raymond was asked one question that the trial transcript would record as lasting 4 minutes because of the silence Raymond allowed to develop before answering it. Kevin asked him, "Mr. Cole, if you loved your daughter and thought of her every day for 11 years, can you explain to the jury why, in 11 years, you made no attempt to contact her, no attempt to verify her welfare, no attempt to undo an arrangement you describe as a mistake?" The silence lasted 4 minutes. Then Raymond said, "I was afraid." Kevin said, "Of what?" Raymond said, "Of everything unraveling." Kevin said, "And by everything, you mean the defense contractor investigation?" Raymond said, "I mean everything." Kevin said, "No further questions." The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned on a Thursday afternoon at 2:17. The verdict was guilty on all 6 counts. Raymond Cole sat entirely still when the foreperson read the first count. He sat entirely still through the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. On the 6th count, which was the conspiracy charge that connected the financial fraud to the identity construction to the 11 years of paid silence, he put one hand flat on the table in front of him, very carefully, as if he needed to feel something solid. The gesture was small. The courtroom was large, but the cameras caught it, and the people watching on the monitor 2 floors down saw it on the screen, and the people standing in the hallway heard it described by someone watching through the open door, and the detail traveled, the way details travel when they are the right ones, outward from the courtroom in Burlington through the news feeds and the social media and the ordinary conversations of ordinary people who had been following this story for a year and who had, in following it, come to feel something about it that they did not entirely have words for, but that the hand on the table made suddenly clear. Raymond Cole was remanded into custody pending sentencing. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs that were applied with the bureaucratic efficiency of people doing a job they have done many times and that Raymond accepted without resistance, without expression, without the performance of composure that had characterized every other moment of the trial. The handcuffs went on and Raymond Cole looked for the first time in public like a man who had run out of room. Nora was outside the courthouse when the verdict was announced. She had left the gallery after Raymond's testimony and had not come back for the deliberations. She was standing on the front steps in the February cold with her coat buttoned to the throat when Marcus came out of the building and told her the verdict. She said, "All 6?" He said, "All 6." She nodded. She looked at the street, the bare trees, the brick buildings, the pale winter sky over Burlington that was the exact color of the lake on a cold morning. She thought, the color of the water that people had spent 11 days searching for a child who was not in it. She said, "Good," not with satisfaction exactly, with the particular quality of relief that comes not from winning something, but from having a truth finally confirmed by people with the authority to confirm it. The truth had been true for a year. It had been true for 11 years. But 12 strangers in a courthouse had now said out loud that it was true, in a form that Raymond Cole and his 40-year empire and his $4 billion and his practiced composure and his white-collar legal team could not appeal their way around. It was in the record. It was permanent. Whatever happened next, and there was more that happened next, this was permanent. She stood on the steps in the February cold, and Marcus stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Nora said, "I want to go back to work tomorrow." Marcus said, "You do not have to go back to work tomorrow." She said, "I know." She looked at the sky. She said, "But the people I work with need someone to show up, and I know how to show up. That is the one thing no one could take from me. That is the one thing I built that was entirely mine." Marcus did not say anything. He looked at the street. After a moment, Nora said, "I want to go see Gloria. I want to tell her myself." Marcus said, "I will drive you to the airport." She said, "I know you will." She turned up the collar of her coat and walked down the steps of the federal courthouse in Burlington, Vermont, and the cameras followed her, and the reporters called her name, and she did not stop, because she had somewhere to be, and she had always been the kind of person who went where she needed to go, who showed up, who did not let the difficulty of the floor moving stop her from walking across it. She had learned that at 9 years old. She had been practicing it for 22 years. She was very good at it by now. But the story was not done. 3 months after the verdict, on a Tuesday morning that began like any other Tuesday morning, a letter arrived. And what was inside it would not change the verdict, would not change the sentence, would not change any of the legal outcomes that had been determined in that courthouse in Burlington. But it would answer the last question, the one that had not been asked in the trial, the one that had been sitting at the center of everything from the beginning, quiet and unresolved, waiting for someone to find the words for it. And the person who found the words for it was an 82-year-old man in a nursing home in Burlington who had been going to sleep every night for 11 years with a weight on his chest that he had finally decided he could not carry anymore. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, 3 months and 4 days after the verdict. It came by certified mail, addressed to Nora Vasquez at the Phoenix Gazette. She had asked Marcus to use that address for anything trial-related because it was easier to manage the volume of correspondence that had come in the months following the news coverage, and because having a professional address between herself and the rest of the world gave her a layer of distance she had found she needed as the story moved from something she had experienced privately into something the public had decided it owned a piece of. The return address on the envelope was a long-term care facility in Burlington, Vermont. The handwriting was old, deliberate in the way of someone for whom writing had become an act of physical effort rather than ordinary expression. Each letter formed with the concentrated attention of a hand that was no longer entirely reliable. Marcus recognized the facility's name before he recognized the significance of the return address. He had driven past it on his way to Carol Ashby's house the previous November. He called Nora before he opened it, because the letter was addressed to her, and he had made a commitment, early in their working relationship, that anything addressed to Nora would go to Nora before it went anywhere else. Nora told him to open it and read it to her over the phone, because she was at work and she had a patient meeting in 20 minutes, and she had learned over the course of the preceding year that the best way to receive difficult information was to receive it in motion rather than in stillness, because motion gave her somewhere to put what she felt while she was still feeling it. Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded in thirds, covered on both sides in the same careful, labored handwriting as the address. He read it to Nora from beginning to end without stopping. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Nora said, "He saw the car." Marcus said, "Yes." She said, "He saw the car leave with 3 people in it." Marcus said, "Yes." She said, "And he said nothing for 11 years." Marcus said, "Yes." Another silence. Then Nora said, "How old is he now?" Marcus looked at the letter. He said, "He says he is 82. He says he has been in the facility for 8 months. He says his doctors have told him he has perhaps 4 to 6 months more." Nora was quiet. Then she said, "He kept it long enough. I think he kept it long enough to be sure it could not hurt him. Then he let it go because he could not die with it. I understand that. I do not forgive it, but I understand it." Gerald Mast had written 4 pages. In them, he described the morning of June 16th in detail that had not appeared in any previous account, not in his original police statement, which he acknowledged in the letter he had given with deliberate incompleteness, and not in any of the trial proceedings, which he had followed from his room in the facility on a small television that one of the staff members had helped him position so he could watch without sitting up. He described waking early that morning, earlier than usual, before 5, because he had slept badly after the voices he had heard the night before, and because there was a quality to the silence of that morning, he wrote, that felt wrong in a way he could not name, but that he had learned to pay attention to after 60 years of living close to land and water, where the silence before something happens has a different texture than ordinary silence. He described putting on his boots and walking the access road toward the main house in the gray light before sunrise, not with any specific intention, he wrote, only because his body had decided to go, and he had learned to listen to his body. He described seeing the main house lights on. He described seeing Raymond's vehicle, the dark blue SUV that Raymond always drove to the lake. Not one of the other vehicles in the estate fleet, but that specific one. Because Raymond had a habit of driving himself when he came to Whitaker Lake. One of the small autonomies he maintained in a life otherwise administered by staff. Pulled up to the side entrance of the house rather than parked in the usual place on the gravel pad. He described standing at the edge of the access road in the tree line, perhaps 50 yards from the vehicle, watching. He wrote that he did not know why he stopped, rather than continuing toward the house. He wrote that something stopped him. He wrote that he was not a man who believed in premonitions or in the kind of language people used for things they could not explain, but that he had no other word for what made him stand in the tree line and watch rather than continue walking. He described Raymond coming out of the side entrance carrying 2 bags. He described a second man, not someone Gerald had seen before, not part of the regular estate staff, coming out behind Raymond, carrying a 3rd bag. He described Raymond going back inside. He described the second man loading the bags into the back of the SUV. He described Raymond coming out a second time, with something over his arm, that Gerald could not identify clearly in the low light, but that he thought was clothing, children's clothing, folded. He described Raymond and the second man exchanging words he was too far away to hear. And then he described the 3rd person. She came out of the side entrance between the 2 men. She was walking on her own. She was wearing a coat that was too large for her, Gerald thought, the sleeves past her wrists. She was not crying. She was not struggling. She was walking with the particular stillness of a child who has been told to be quiet and has decided, for reasons of her own, to comply. Not from obedience, Gerald wrote, but from the same quality of watchfulness he had always associated with Belle, with the way she had always moved through the world, as though she was storing information about it for later use. He described her stopping at the vehicle door. He described her turning, just before she got in, and looking back at the house. Not at Gerald, she could not have seen him in the tree line in that light, but at the house, as if she was memorizing it, as if she understood, on some level, that she was not coming back. Gerald described watching the vehicle drive down the access road and turn onto the highway. He described walking back to his house. He described sitting in his kitchen for an hour before his wife woke up and asking himself what he had seen and what it meant and what he was going to do about it. And then he described Raymond Cole appearing at his door 3 days later, not with the second man, alone, which Gerald noted, because Raymond rarely came to his door alone and never without a reason, and sitting in his kitchen and talking about the search and the tragedy and what a terrible thing it was. And then, before leaving, Raymond had placed an envelope on the kitchen table. Gerald did not write the amount. He wrote only that it was enough to pay off the mortgage on his house, which he had been struggling with since his wife's illness had begun generating medical bills that exceeded what his caretaker's salary could absorb. He wrote, "I took it. I told myself I had seen nothing definitive. I told myself that even if I had seen what I thought I saw, reporting it would be my word against Raymond Cole's, and I knew what my word was worth against Raymond Cole's. I told myself my wife needed the house. She died 8 months later. I kept the house, and I kept what I had seen, because by then, I had told myself these things so many times that the telling had become the only version I was able to hold on to. But I knew what I had seen, and I have known every day since." He wrote that he had followed the trial closely. He wrote that he had heard Nora's testimony described in the news reports. He had not been able to hear it directly, he wrote, because hearing it directly was something he had understood he did not have the right to do comfortably, and so he had listened to the reports and read the transcripts in the newspaper and let the words of a woman he had last seen as a child, getting into a car before sunrise, find their way into the room where he was sitting, which was the least he could do, and considerably less than he should have done. He wrote that the verdict was right, and that he was glad of it, and that he was aware that gladness was not a feeling he had earned. He wrote that he was writing to Nora and not to the authorities, because he was 82 years old, and he had 4 to 6 months, and the authorities had their verdict, and he did not think they needed him, but he thought she might need to know that someone had seen her leave. He thought she might need to know that the morning had not been empty, that there had been a witness, even a failed one, even a paid-off one, and that she had been seen, that she had turned to look at the house, and she had been seen turning. He wrote, "I could not protect you. I am sorry for that. But I saw you. I want you to know that someone saw you." Nora was silent for a long time after Marcus finished reading. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it always was. Steady, clear, the voice of a woman who has decided that the only honest response to difficult things is to be present with them, rather than to manage them from a distance. She said, "He saw me turn and look at the house." Marcus said, "Yes." She said, "I do not remember doing that. I do not remember that morning at all, not in images, only in feeling, the feeling of the light and the movement and the cold. But I must have turned." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I am glad he wrote it. I wish he had written it 11 years ago. I wish he had written it the day of. But I am glad he wrote it now, because I have been living for a long time in a story where no one saw me leave. And it matters to know that I was seen, even by someone who said nothing, even by someone who took the money. It still matters to know I was seen." She did not write back to Gerald Mast. She did not visit him in the facility. She made a decision, which she described later in her written account, that she was not going to give Gerald Mast absolution, because absolution was not hers to give, and because he had not asked for it. He had asked for nothing, she noted, which she found more honest than a request for forgiveness would have been. He had simply told her what he had seen. She received that, she held it, and she decided that holding it was enough, and that what she did with the time she had was more important than any further engagement with the past that Gerald Mast represented. Gerald Mast died 6 weeks after sending the letter. His confession was submitted to the court record by the DOJ as supplementary material, relevant to the sentencing proceeding, with Nora's permission. It was entered into the public record on a Thursday afternoon, without ceremony and without press, in the ordinary bureaucratic way that important things are sometimes recorded. Quietly, finally, with no one present who had been present at the beginning. Raymond Cole's sentencing took place 4 months after the verdict, on a Friday morning in June, in the same courtroom where the trial had been held. The sentencing guidelines for the combined charges, as argued by the government and calculated by the court, produced a recommended range that Kevin Hargrove argued should be applied at its upper boundary given the duration of the offense, the degree of premeditation, the harm to a minor child, and the sustained obstruction of the judicial process over 11 years. Catherine Marsh argued for the lower boundary, presenting letters from business associates and philanthropic partners and people who described Raymond Cole as a man of significant positive contributions to his community. The kind of letters that appear at every sentencing for every defendant who has spent their life in positions of power and influence, and whose circle of professional acquaintance is therefore populated with people who have reasons to remember them well. The judge read the letters. The judge listened to both arguments. The judge looked at Raymond Cole and asked if he had anything to say. Raymond Cole said he did. He stood and spoke for approximately 8 minutes. He said he had failed his daughter. He said there was no adequate explanation for what he had done, only the inadequate one he had offered at trial, which he understood the jury had not found persuasive, and which he had had sufficient time in the months since the verdict to understand was not the honest account he should have given from the beginning. He said the honest account was simpler and less forgivable. He had been afraid of losing what he had built, and he had chosen his empire over his child, and he had spent 11 years telling himself the story of a man who had made a terrible decision under terrible pressure, until the story had become the only interior life he had access to. He said he was aware that this confession came too late, and in the wrong room and at the wrong moment to serve any purpose other than the purpose of his own conscience, and that he was not asking for it to be taken as mitigating. He said he was asking only that it be heard. He sat down. The judge sentenced Raymond Cole to 26 years in federal prison. Given his age, he was 63 at sentencing. The sentence represented what the court's analysis described as an effective life term for the purposes of his realistic lifespan. His attorney filed notice of appeal within 48 hours. The appeal would wind through the courts for 2 years before being denied in its entirety. Raymond Cole was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania 8 weeks after sentencing and has remained there since. Cole Meridian Holdings entered receivership 4 months after the sentencing. The weight of the government's financial fraud judgment, $680 million inclusive of penalties and restitution, combined with the civil litigation that had accumulated around the case in the intervening years, proving to be more than the restructured firm could absorb. Its assets were sold in pieces over the course of a year and a half. The glass-walled corporate tower in Hartford where Raymond Cole had stood before floor-to-ceiling windows and surveyed the city below was purchased by a real estate investment firm and converted to mixed-use residential. The private equity portfolio was unwound. The Whitaker Lake property sat unsold for 2 years before being purchased by a conservation trust that has allowed it to return to something close to its natural state. The dock still stands. Gerald Mast's house, which he left to a nephew in his will, was sold the following spring. Claire Beaumont Cole, operating under the terms of her immunity agreement, testified fully and served no prison time. She moved to the south of France and has not spoken publicly since the trial ended. Whether she has found anything in the south of France that functions as peace is a question that belongs to her private life, and the people who have followed this story closely tend to have strong opinions about whether she deserves to have a private life at all. Those opinions are understandable. What is also true is that without Claire's testimony, the prosecution's case would have been considerably more difficult to make. Not impossible, but harder. And that the immunity agreement that granted her freedom was the same agreement that put Raymond Cole in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. These things exist together. The justice system does not always arrive at outcomes that feel entirely satisfying. It arrives at outcomes that the available tools and the available evidence make possible. Sometimes those outcomes contain within them a smaller injustice in the service of a larger one. The people most qualified to have an opinion about that are the ones who were not the ones who made the choice. Nora Vasquez did not change her name. In the written account she published 14 months after the verdict, a book that she had not set out to write, but that had emerged from a series of long conversations with a writer she trusted and that she had ultimately decided to present in her own voice, because it was her story, and it had always been her story, and she was done with other people narrating it for her. She explained this decision in a paragraph near the end that has been quoted widely enough that it has developed the particular life of its own that certain sentences develop when they express something that a large number of people have been trying to find words for and find, in someone else's words, that they have been found. She wrote, Isabella Cole is the name of the child who was taken. Nora Vasquez is the name of the woman who survived the taking. I am both of them, and I am more than both of them, and I am not going to resolve that by picking one and abandoning the other. I am going to carry both names the way I carried the necklace, not because I always understood what they meant, but because they were mine, and mine is not something I am willing to negotiate anymore. The Half Moon Fund, the nonprofit she established with the proceeds from the book, has in the years since its founding provided legal advocacy, identity documentation support, and transitional assistance to more than 400 individuals who aged out of the foster care system under circumstances that raised questions about the accuracy of their placement documentation. Some of those individuals have had their origins clarified. Some have chosen not to pursue clarification once it became available to them, for reasons that are entirely their own and that the fund respects entirely. Some have found family. Some have found only additional loss. The fund operates on the principle, which Nora articulates on its website in language that reflects her characteristic directness, that every person has the right to know who they are, and the right to decide for themselves what to do with that knowledge once they have it. Carol Ashby attended the fund's inaugural event and sat at the same table as Nora and Marcus and Gloria Reyes, who had flown in from Springfield for the occasion and who wore a dress the color of a fig leaf and who looked, Marcus noted in the piece he wrote about the evening, like someone who had known all along that this was where things were going. Gloria and Nora embraced. When Gloria arrived at the venue and held on for a long time in the entryway, while the event around them proceeded, and no one who saw it thought to interrupt. When they finally let go, Gloria held Nora's face in both hands and said something that Marcus was close enough to hear, but that he chose not to include in his piece, because some things are said between two people and belong to those two people, and the fact that a journalist is standing nearby does not alter whose they are. What he did include was what happened afterward, which was that Nora laughed, genuinely, the way she rarely laughed in professional or public settings, the specific unguarded laugh of someone who has been given something they had stopped expecting, and that the sound of it traveled across the room, and people turned to see the source of it and found a woman in a dark dress at the door, laughing with an old woman who smelled like lavender, and felt, without entirely knowing why, that something important had just occurred. Marcus Dean continued to cover financial crime and corporate misconduct for the Phoenix Gazette. He won 2 awards for the series of stories that began with the headline about Nora and the necklace and the billionaire. He accepted both awards with brief, characteristically undemonstrative remarks, and went back to his desk and began working on the next thing, because that is what he did and who he was. He and Nora have remained close in the way that people who have been through something significant together tend to remain close, not because the circumstance requires it, but because they have each decided the other is worth the maintenance, and because that decision is, as most meaningful things are, made not once but continuously. There is a question that runs underneath every story like this one, underneath the verdicts and the sentences and the legal proceedings and the documents entered into the public record, that the formal machinery of justice is not designed to answer, and does not try to answer, because it is not a legal question. It is this: what does it cost a human being to be unmade? To have the name they were given taken, and a new one substituted, and the life that should have been built around the original name scattered across a series of foster homes in western Massachusetts, while the man responsible for the scattering polished his reputation and attended charity galas and had his name put on a conference room wall? What does that cost? Not in the abstract, not as a rhetorical question, but in the specific daily currency of an actual life. In the moments of confusion and the habits of not investing. In the particular loneliness of holidays in houses that are kind but not yours. In the years of building and rebuilding and building again on a foundation that was never as solid as it should have been? The answer, insofar as there is one, is that we do not have adequate language for it. The law has language for the crimes: obstruction, abandonment, conspiracy, fraud. The law can sentence a man to 26 years and call that proportional and enter it into the record and close the file. But the cost that Nora Vasquez absorbed in 22 years of living inside someone else's silence is not a number that fits in a file. It is the kind of cost that gets paid quietly, in increments, over a lifetime, by a person who had no choice but to pay it, and who did so with a grace that she did not owe anyone, and chose to maintain anyway. Because grace was the thing she had, that Raymond Cole, with all his money and all his resources and all his 40 years of building and protecting and managing, had never been able to buy or manufacture or arrange. She has it still. She carries it the way she carried the necklace, without making a production of it, without requiring anyone to notice, simply present at her collarbone, simply hers, simply there. And if you have stayed with this story from the beginning, if you have been here through the lobby in Phoenix and the lake house in Vermont, and the cardboard box on Carol Ashby's shelf, and the 4 minutes of silence before Raymond Cole said he was afraid, then you already know something that the formal record of this case does not fully capture. You know that the most important moment in this entire story is not the verdict, and it is not the sentence, and it is not the indictment or the DNA results, or Arthur Greer's recorded phone call. It is a 9-year-old girl in an oversized coat on a cold morning in June, turning to look back at the house she grew up in before getting into a car she did not choose, in a moment she will not remember, and a man standing in the tree line 50 yards away will remember for the rest of his life and carry for 11 years, and finally, imperfectly, too late and not too late, put into words so that someone would know she had been seen. She turned, she looked, she was seen, and 22 years later she walked into a federal courthouse in Burlington and sat down in a witness chair and told 12 strangers exactly who she was and exactly what it had cost. And when it was over, she walked down the courthouse steps in the February cold and said she wanted to go back to work and she wanted to see Gloria. And that is the whole of it. That is the full shape of what a human being can do with what they have been given, regardless of who gave it to them, or why, or what it cost. You take what you have. You show up. You build what you can with what remains. The necklace is in a drawer now, in Nora's apartment near Camelback Mountain. She does not wear it every day anymore. She does not need to. She knows where it is. She knows what it means. She knows who she is. The fig tree on the balcony is 12 years old, and should not, by any reasonable horticultural standard, be thriving in a pot in the Arizona heat. It is thriving. Some things refuse the conditions they are given. Some things persist, past every reasonable expectation of their survival, and find a way to produce something sweet from the effort. Nora Vasquez understands this. She has understood it for a long time. She is, after all, one of those things. Now, we have one question for you, and we genuinely want your answer. If you had been Gerald Mast, if you had stood in that tree line on that June morning and watched that car drive away, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments. And while you are there, tell us where you are watching from. We read every single comment. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button right now, @TalesByT+, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the next story will be more interesting. We will see you there.